Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Fred Hayes, Apollo 13 from the States. Wishing I could be closer, even in person, for the celebration 50th anniversary, since we flew that mission back in 1970. Kind of auspicious with the current circumstances we have around the world. Our mission in the week before our flight had a great challenge and threat of a virus. We had all been exposed by Charlie Duke, who had gone to a birthday party with his son, to German measles, which is a virus, although I'll have to say not near as threatening as the one the world is dealing with today. Nevertheless, though, it caused us within the crew a traumatic incident. We were all exposed, and through the blood work and testing, it was determined that Ken Manningly, the primary crew command module, which Jim Lovell and I had worked with through a previous whole crew assignment, Apollo 11. We were the backup on Apollo 11. And here we were already going 13, and Ken was replaced. The decision was made 2.5 days before our launch that Jack Schweigert would replace Ken. So that was a very traumatic decision, and kind of took away for me a little bit of the excitement of going with that. Just seeing how distraught that was, I knew for Ken to have worked that hard to get to this point and then be pulled off at the last minute. But anyway, just should have known then that Apollo 13 wasn't going to be exactly the normal mission.
Wonderful.
So anyway, have a happy time, everybody, and I hope this your internet works out on the web to have this gathering.
Thank you so much, Fred. And once again, thank you so much for taking time. Do look after yourself and your wife, and enjoy your 50th anniversary, however you're going to be able to do it.
Likewise, everybody else, take care of yourselves.
Thank you so much, Fred. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'll talk to you sometime soon.
Okay.
All right, that was lovely. I spoke to him earlier this morning, and I've met him once before at Space Fest, and a lovely gentleman. And I think a few of the people on this session have actually met Fred and would attest to that. All right, so let's get started. Tonight's program is going to start off with, I'm going to do a little thing about the explosion events, what happened in regard to that and how it all transpired and the timelines. Then we're going to hear from Colin on the Australian Space Network and Comms Network. Then we're going to hear about Honeysuckle Creek, Apollo, that manned space network from John and his experiences on Apollo 13. And then we'll go over to Mike for Australia, Honeysuckle Creek, Apollo 13 mission support tracking challenges, and also we'll hear from Bruce Window. Now, Colin, John, and Bruce, you don't know yet, but I'm going to introduce you in the next couple of slides, so just relax. And also, Mike, we're going to look at John Feast's real-time Apollo in real-time page and project, and it's incredible. We're going to have some Q&A, so once again, if you've got questions, put them in that chat box, and we'll have a look at them toward the end. And as I mentioned, I did do this interview last night this morning with Fred. I only played a couple of minutes of the greeting that he sent to us, which was lovely. But I also did about a 35-minute interview with him, and it's a really nice interview. So if you're still up and about and conscious, I'll play that at the end of this session. All right. So my name's Peter. And introduce myself. I'm the president of the Space Association, and we're a space and space-like interest group here in Melbourne. That's our website. So if you want to find out more details, have a look at that. So the speakers, Colin MacKellar, he's a former geologist, but he's now turned to an Anglican minister in Sydney. And he grew up the Apollo area, and as it says on the screen, he now runs the absolutely amazing honeysucklecreek.net website, which if you haven't been there, give yourself a month, just dig into it. It's quite incredible. This is the page here. you see those links on the left. It started off just being about Honeysuckle Creek and has now expanded out dramatically to other stations, the early days, what's going on. And I see someone's got a beer there going, that's good. And different missions, etc. So there's obviously a big section on Apollo, but there's also a lot of the other deep space and manned space flight tracking things in there as well. So get onto it. All right. I'm just going to see if I can do something here. No, I won't do that. Yeah, okay. All right. So next slide is, so that's the URL there for honeysucklecreek.net. So do yourself a favor, as Molly would say. Next, we're going to hear from John Saxon. John was the operations supervisor at Honeysuckle Creek at the tracking station here. He supported all the Apollo missions at the operations console. And John also spoke to John Young and Charlie Duke on the lunar surface to see if he gets time, he might tell you about that. He wasn't supposed to, but he stepped in and had to fill in the gap. Then following that, we'll have Mike Dinn. Mike, his early career in avionics and aircraft flight testing. He then became the deputy director at Tibb & Biller. And then he also did the surveyor while he was there. And then he moved over to Honeysuckle Creek when it was established and became the deputy director in '67. Mike has got lots of stories. He covered all the Apollos from 7 to 13. So we're going to hear a lot from Mike. And then we're also going to hear from Bruce Window. Bruce was at the Weapons Research Establishment as a technician at the National Mini-Track Satellite Tracking Station in Woomera. And then he moved over to Operations Supervisor at Tibb & Biller for deep space and manned space flight missions from 65 to 75. He supervised the manned space flight operations at Parkes as well, so we'll hear about that. So let's have a look at the time and what actually was happening. We're celebrating 50 years, so when was that in Australia? So it was actually 4:13 tomorrow morning here in Australia at the 12th of April, although it was the 11th of April in the US. The explosion happened at 1:08 on the 14th, so mark that in your calendars. And then we had the splashdown next Saturday on the 18th at 6:07 a.m. So pause and mark that on your calendar and have a think about Apollo 13. All right, I'm going to now play a quick little video which Colin MacKellar supplied to me. This came from, well, it's the launch TV from Apollo 13. It was the only time, I believe Colin is correct, the only time they mounted a colour TV camera at the top of the tower for the launch. And I believe it was identical technology to what they used for the colour TV on the moon in space. So let's play that now.
We'll be looking for an ignition of those 5 first stage engines at the T-minus 8.9 second mark. We've passed T-minus 30, T-minus 25 seconds and counting, and Apollo 13 is go. T-minus 20 seconds, T-minus 20 seconds and counting. 17, guidance release, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit and we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it has cleared the tower.
So once again, Colin getting in there and getting some unique footage, etc. All right, so I'm going to now spend a few slides looking at the explosion background itself to sort of understand. We've all seen the movie and it kind of brushes over a little bit, but I thought hopefully you might be interested to see a bit of detail about how it actually transpired. So the key dates in this whole scenario started back in March the 11th, 1968. So 2 years before the actual flight took off. Then in August of '68, there's another key event which we'll go through. October the 21st, 68. So a lot of stuff happening in 68. So the seed was set. And then March 25th in 70, which for people who are familiar with the mission, that was before the launch itself. And then, of course, the actual explosion took place on April the 14th in Australia. So let's have a look at 1968. 1968, the March 11th was the assembly of that oxygen tank, the actual serial number of the tank at Beach, which is the company that built it. So there was nothing that needed to be done. So all was looking good at that stage. So then the oxygen shelf itself, so that's a shelf. So there's a tank and then there's a platform on which it sits and that gets bolted in. So that was installed on the 4th of June in 68 into the service module for service module 106, which was going to fly Apollo 10. Testing, everything worked fine, no anomalies noted. Everything's tickety-boo. In August, they decided, because of some testing they'd done on the cryogenic tank domes in earlier spacecraft, that they decided they were going to make a modification and replace those tanks, make the modification. So they're going to take that out. So they decided to replace that with the approved modifications later on. So October 21, that was on the key dates, if you recall. The shelf was removed from that service module. That was the Apollo 10 service module for the required modification. It was taken out and it was actually going to be used for later spacecraft, which turned out to be Apollo 13. After various lines and wires were disconnected, bolts were removed and the fixture suspended from a crane was placed under the shelf to lift it out. Now, I've highlighted it. One shelf bolt was mistakenly left in during the final, during the initial attempt to remove it. And as a consequence, after the front of the shelf was raised about 2 inches, the fixture broke, allowing the shelf to drop back into place. So they photographed it, they had a good look at it, they thought everything was fine, and they think it may have struck the underside of the shelf during this time. But they investigated and they didn't think there was any problems. They believed that everything was fine, had simply been dropped back into place. An analysis they performed based on those forces of a 2-inch drop. However, it seems likely now, after we know what eventually happened, was that it was first accelerated upward and then dropped. And this is very significant. So the remaining bolt was then removed, the instrument recorded, the shelf was removed without further difficulty. Following the removal, the oxygen shelf was retested to check the shelf integrity, including the approved pressure test, leak test, etc. All the visual inspections revealed no problem, so they thought they were tickety-boo. These tests would have discovered any external leakage or serious internal fluctuations, but did not disclose fill line leakage within tank number 2. So that is significant, as we'll find out later. So here's a diagram of the service module, and these are the various fixtures that you can see that they use to install and remove. So there's the oxygen tank and the oxygen platform, and the fixture that they use to put that in and remove that. Now, subsequent to the accident, they went back and looked at the photographs that they'd taken of the service module for Apollo 10, and they actually realized that there was some damage. You can see at the top there, that circle, at the top of the shelf, which was above the oxygen platform, which indicated that, yes, indeed, the top of the tank did hit the bottom of the shelf above, setting the scene for what transpired later on. So this is looking down at the top of the tanks there in that shelf that I was talking about. November the 22nd, the shelf passed test and was installed in 109, which is Apollo 13. So they'd taken that out. That was the one that they had the problem with. They tested it, everything looked fine. They tickety-boo and they put it back in. They put it into Apollo 13, I should say. Apollo 10 had already had theirs. So that on the bottom left-hand corner is the tank itself with the red box, and the right-hand side is the X-ray sort of look at the internal workings of the oxygen tank itself. The investigation board, after the accident, of course, happened to determine that the probability of the tank damage from this accident was low, but it was possible the loose fitting fill tube might have become displaced by the drop. Now, the loose fill fitting didn't cause the explosion, but it sowed the seed. So they're thinking that what happened was that after the thing happened, they think that the actual fire started at these wire bundles down there, and we'll find out why later in a few slides. So we move into 1969. The whole processing for 13 is progressing nicely. The service module and command module get to the Kennedy Space Center on June the 26th, and they start all the assembly and together, pre-flight testing, altitude chambers, the whole deal. The lunar module then arrives this 27th and 28th of June from New York. The Saturn V vehicle itself, it's actually started the assembly. There's the first stage at July 20, and the stacking is happening. July 20, 69, pretty significant date, but they were still working on the next missions coming up after 11, of course. 31st, they completed the stack of the Saturn V stages. August of 1969, they announced the crews for 13 and 14. Obviously, August is after the July landing. And they also announced where they were going to be landing on the Frau Mara region, which is indicated on the arrow there. So the prime crew was, as we know, Jim Lovell, Ken Mattingly, and Fred Hayes. The backups were John Young, Jack Swigert, and Charlie Duke. All right, so everything's happened in 69. The vehicle's all stacked. Everything's looking great. The crews are assigned and the location's set. Then up pops January the 4th. Tom Paine announced that the cancellation of the final moon landing mission, Apollo 20, due to the budget. That sounds familiar. The schedule for the remaining moon missions would be stretched out, lengthening the intervals between flights from 4 to 6 months. So then January the 7th, the first change, then moved the Apollo 13 mission from March the 12th to April the 11th. All right, now we fast forward to March the 16th. And I assume most people might be familiar with the countdown demonstration test. Essentially, it's a rehearsal of all the steps that lead up to the actual launch. So there's two phases of the wet phase and the dry phase. The wet phase includes all the fueling of all the vehicle, etc. And they go right down to T-minus 8.9 seconds. The crew is not on board at this stage in the wet rehearsal. So they began with the loading of the kerosene. Then on 16th, after they've recycled back to 24, T-minus 24, they drained all the fuel, and then they get the crew out and go through all those suiting procedures, getting the command module, do everything that would happen on launch day down to -0. So there's the three guys getting ready. And then one of two significant events happened in the Apollo 13 processing. The first one was on the 25th of March. Engineers pumping super cold liquid in the first incident of the countdown. 3 security guards parked their patrol cars near a ditch where the engineers dumped the excess liquid oxygen nearby the launch pad at 39A. Normally this didn't cause a problem, but on this particular morning, the wind was very calm and the liquid oxygen fog formed in the area where the guards had parked their cars. What could possibly go wrong? When one of the guards started his car, the spark from the ignition caused the oxygen fog to catch fire, consuming that car as well as 3 others. And there's a picture. How many you go with your insurance claim on that one? Anyway, you can see that bit of damage there. Fortunately, there was no one injured, and they halted the test, drained the lines, and no one suffered any injuries, which is quite amazing. But they didn't park the car in that location any longer. All right, so that's happened on that last day there. Now, the second incident, the more significant incident, happened on the 25th as well. Far-reaching consequences. And it began during the wet phase of the countdown demonstration test. When the engineers attempted to partially drain the oxygen from the two service module tanks, one tank emptied normally, but tank 2 only emptied to by about 8%, possibly due to a problem with the fill line, as we found out later. Managers decided to continue with the countdown demonstration test and return to the oxygen tank after the test was completed. The 26th day after the countdown demonstration test finished, engineers returned to that oxygen tank and tried to work out what was going on, attempted to vent the remaining oxygen. They attempted another normal detanking. Tank 1 behaved properly, tank 2 didn't. So they next attempted to boil off that oxygen. You probably heard the story, but they using the heaters and the fans in the tank and powered them using the 65 volt ground support equipment. They finally emptied that after 8 hours and 5 heater cycles. What was not known is that the switches in the tank's heater circuits were rated only to 28 degrees, 28 volts, I should say, in the spacecraft. So obviously the voltages were way out. The switches were designed to open the circuit when the heater reaches 80 degrees. So if it got above that, it was supposed to cut up. But of course, what happened, because of the higher voltage, the switch fused and locked it down, so the cutoff didn't happen. So the temperature continued to go up and up and up. The result of that was that they believed that the Teflon insulation around some of the wiring in that tank was damaged. They didn't know at the time. They decided it wouldn't be necessary to replace the tank. It would have caused a big delay and they didn't want to do that. Everything seemed to be tickety-boo. So the seed was set. Okay, the other little drama, and Fred mentioned it in his video before, April the 9, he was the backup crew member, command module member. Charlie Duke contracted rubella from a friend of his son, exposed to the prime crew members to that. Of all of them, only Mattingly was not immune. And this is interesting, I found this out. Normally, if a crew member of a prime crew had to be grounded, the remaining crew would also be replaced and the backup crew substituted. But because of Duke was on the backup crew, they couldn't do that. So consequently, they only ended up replacing Mattingly with Duke, with Swigert. So that happened a couple of days before the launch. So a bit of drama there. And that's a press conference where they announced it. Okay, so a few things had to happen. Of course, you got your Saturn V rocket, you got your lunar module, and you got your plaque that's going to land on the moon. It's got Ken's name. So we have to go ahead and change that. So they hastily had a new plaque manufactured. But the thing's out on top of the launch pad under that cone underneath the command and service module. How do you get to it? Well, they thought of everything. There's a hatch you can see in the bottom left-hand corner on the cover above the covers of the lunar module. And in fact, they access it all the time to put in late equipment and etc. right up to the launch date. So that wasn't unusual that they go in there, but obviously they had to use that access for this. So basically that little door there is on the side of the spacecraft, you can see. And this gives you an idea of the tight squeeze in there. They had to erect special access platforms and squeeze in and unscrew the old plaque and put the new one in. So nice bit of a drama there. So the seed was set. So before the launch, the engineers filled up the tanks and everything was fine. The damage insulation was there, but it was actually pretty dangerous even it stood on the launch pad, but they didn't know that. And they had actually done some cycling of those as well. So they stood in cryogenic tanks. But anyway, that's a picture of them about to climb up and get into their rocket for launch. And of course, April the 11th launch day, they walk out to their van and off they go to the launch pad and had a beautiful launch. Now, we've all seen the movie and we all know where Ken was at the launch, right? He had a really good parking spot right beside the launch pad, and he watched the launch right up close. He had to sort of step back a little bit. Well, not exactly, as we probably all realise. Ken was actually at Mission Control in Houston during the launch itself, and that's Joe Curran, who was a Capcom at that stage. In fact, Joe was a Capcom for large portions of the mission. But all was not lost. Ken actually was very disappointed, and as Fred in his video mentioned, he was pretty gutted that he didn't get to go on the Apollo 13 mission. But of all the people that won and lost out of 13, I think Ken got the best deal. He ended up flying Apollo 16 and doing extended orbits around the moon, and did a deep spacewalk between the Earth and the moon on the way back after the landing. So he had a very unique experience, one of only 3 people that have actually ever done that. So good on you, Ken. He stayed with the space program, and in fact, he had 2 shuttle flights as well in June to July of '82 as commander of STS-4, and also January 24. I think I've got the end date for that on STS-151. All right, I'm just about finished with my section, but I did find, and Mike will talk about this later on. This is John Feast's amazing Apollo in real time. I was hunting around for some particular information about some communications, and I came upon this little gem. I thought you might enjoy it. It only goes for about 2 minutes. Oh, sorry. You have to listen closely. So this is a network in the control room and around the world.
Have any data at all from either command module or limit?
This is just for about a half an hour before entry interface of Apollo 13.
If you look at channel 20, you'll see that's 63 by Guam. Question mark? Fismer network on cord. Yeah. We're just talking about the Go ahead.
Fismer on call.
Yeah, but hey, Ernie?
Yeah.
Did you copy that call from building 48?
Yeah, but there's no air conditioning in the second floor VIP room?
That's firm.
Yeah, we copied that. That's okay.
Well, there's nothing to take the smoke out of. You get a bunch of people in there smoking your lungs.
Okay. I'll pass on to the second floor VIP room monitor that they ought to watch the smoking in there because there's no circulation. Hey, listen, would you tell Eddie to go ahead and throw both of the switches, the TV switches for the commercial TV, both the flight director and the FISMR? He can go ahead and throw them now rather than entry interface.
Okay.
Some people don't seem to think we can do it.
Who's some people?
Huh? I can't repeat the names right now. They're in the room.
Okay. Okay, and you're going to take it upon yourself to make sure the fire alarms don't go off in those 2 rooms.
Raj.
Okay.
Okay.
You're being taped.
Okay.
I don't know about you, but I thought that was really amazing. Like we had 35 minutes or so before they're about to re-enter the atmosphere, and they're having this conversation. So fantastic. Oh, well, that's the end of my little session. Thank you for that. I hope it came through okay. I'm now going to hand over to Colin MacKellar. So I will stop sharing my screen. And I believe I've now stopped sharing.
Yes.
Is that correct, Mike? And you're up, Colin.
And let's see, is that working?
I can see that.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Well, I've been given the job of giving a quick overview for the 50th anniversary of the background to Honeysuckle, Apollo 13, and the Australian story. In other words, to say Australia had a great involvement in space tracking before Apollo 13, and this is a quick picture of that. It's the Australian story, and it starts back in 1957, 1958, the International Geophysical Year, and the plans for Project Vanguard to get a civilian satellite in orbit around the Earth. Of course, the Russians upset some of that, but that's where it started. And if a satellite was to be put in orbit by the US, you'd need to track it as it passed around the Earth. And this was Australia's first involvement in space tracking. we already had the Weapons Research Establishment in Australia, part of the Australian Department of Supply, and I guess everybody knows that they ran the Woomera rocket range, which was a huge area for testing guided missiles and all sorts of other stuff from Woomera in South Australia. And that was set up in 1947. And that was the ideal place to put the first tracking stations well away from any interference. And so here's a picture taken at the Woomera rocket range. Bruce Winder sent me this picture. This was one of Australia's first space trackers, Ernest Ned Kelly. And he's at the controls of the very first mini track at Woomera in about, I think, 1958, maybe 57 this was taken. The Woomera mini track was set up on range G at the rocket range for the International Geophysical Year, and it was set up by the US Naval Research Laboratory. Built in 57, operational the next year, staffed by Australians, run by the Department of Supply, and Ned was one of the very first. Now, it was a very hands-on way of receiving satellite telemetry, both using the crossed arms of the mini track, which used interferometry to work out when a satellite crossed the sky, but also to listen in on the early satellites. And this is some audio that Bruce had on a tape that he recorded in, I think, 1963. He might correct me on that. This is how it sounded. That's a proper satellite sound, I think. Well, in 1958, NASA was formed and brought together in this civilian agency all of the different space-related activities of the US. And not long after that, the mini track on the range at Woomera moved south of Woomera to the nearby Idle Lagoon, when NASA's Deep Space Station was built in 1960. It was the first deep space station built outside the US. The first one, of course, being at Goldstone in the Mojave Desert in California. Second one, Idle Lagoon, and then another one was built in South Africa. And this was some pictures of the construction of the 85-foot antenna at Idle Lagoon. Right out in the middle of nowhere, and you can see the salt lake, the dry lake in the background. This is an aerial picture of the Idle Lagoon site. And you'll see in the foreground the 85-foot antenna of the Deep Space Station, DSS-41 or DSIF-41. And they also had administration buildings, a Baker Nunn satellite tracking camera, and in the distance, the mini track setup, which also had a satellite tracking camera. And both above and to the left, you can see the dry lake as well. This is a picture of the 85-foot antenna of DSS-41. And DSS-41 is involved in some pretty important missions tracking the early spacecraft to the planets. This is one of the staff pictures fairly early on, and up to 100 people will be there, I'm told, at any given time. Idle Lagoon tracked the rangers and the lunar orbiters in terms of preparation for Apollo. You know, the rangers zoomed in on the moon and took pictures until they crashed into the surface. Lunar orbiters helped compile a highly detailed atlas of the lunar surface, helping to identify lunar landing sites. And of course, the mariners and the pioneers were also tracked from Idle Lagoon. The station operated from 1961 till 1972. In the end, it was closed because it was so expensive to staff and operate a station in such a remote location. And that was one of the reasons Tidbinbilla near Canberra was built in 65. Well, that's Woomera, and that was the first Australian space tracking. But about the same time, over just north of Perth, at a place called Mewshay, on a bombing range, the first Australian manned spaceflight tracking station was set up. Opened in 1961, Mewshay was a part of the Mercury Space Tracking Network, designed to track the one-man Mercury capsule around the world. And here's a quick picture of the space tracking network set up in those early days. Lots of stations, and Mewshay had a telemetry and control building, pretty primitive when you look at the pictures. and a number of antennas for receiving voice and telemetry, and also about a kilometre up the road was a velour radar for getting precise ranging details on a spacecraft as it went over. Muchet's a big day. It was the 20th of February 1962 when John Glenn passed over on his first flight after many delays. He passed over Muchet on his first orbit, second orbit, and just to the north on the third orbit. On the left, you see IOS as the Indian Ocean ship. Then there's Muchet and then Wimmera, next station, which we'll come to in a minute. Now, Perth turned on all the lights so that John Glenn could see. And Comtech Jerry O'Connor was the first Australian to call a space traveller. His job was to sit at that console to monitor the communications, and when it established communications, to hand it over to the Capcom, and for Friendship 7, that was Gordon Cooper. He's sitting opposite Jerry O'Connor, and he had flight specialists, engineers, and flight surgeons with him as well. Now, this is about a minute worth of some footage from a NASA promotional movie made about Friendship 7. And this is looking inside the main operations area at Muchet. Jerry O'Connor is on the right at the distance, and the Capcom is directly behind him. And the guys in the foreground on the left are the antenna operators. And Jack Duperuzel, who's sitting down there in a white shirt, as far as I know, he's the only remaining member of the technical staff from Muchet, still living in Perth. This footage was shot on the day of John Glenn's flight. Some of it was a reenactment later on, but this is the original audio, and I think the footage of the Capcom speaking to the capsule as he went over late on the 20th of February, just before midnight, 1962.
Friendship 7, this is Muchet Comtech. Friendship 7, this is Muchet Comtech. Do read, over. Hello, Muchet Comtech. This is Friendship 7, reading you loud and clear. How many? Roger, Friendship 7, Muchet Capcom. How many, over? Roger. How you doing, Gordo? We're doing real fine up here. Everything is going very well, over. Very good, John. You sound good. Roger. That was sure a short day. Time passes rapidly, huh? Yes, sir. Shortly, you may observe some lights down there. You want to take a check on them out to your right, over? Roger. I'm all set to see if I can't get them in sight. Roger. Roger. I do have a lights in sight on the ground, over. Roger, understand. You're just off to your right there? That's affirmative. Just to my right, I can see a big pattern of lights, apparently right on the coast. I can see the outline of a town and a very bright light just to the south of it. Roger, that's Perth and Rockingham you're seeing there. Roger, the lights show up very well, and thank everybody for turning them on, will you? Roger, sure will, John.
Those days, each tracking station had its own Capcom because the communications network wasn't good enough to ensure real-time communications. So they had somebody on the ground in each place. And you can see on that animation from the Mercury control at the Cape, showing the capsule moving from the view of Muchet to the view of Wimmera. And this was another station built. This was about 40 or 50 kilometres north of Wimmera, right out again in the middle of nowhere. And this was built on the edge of the range. Mercury station number 9 was not a command station. It was receiving, it couldn't command the spacecraft, but it was a fully functional tracking station. And it was built nearby the existing FPS-16 radar, which was already working on the range. And the person in charge of that whole area was Tom Reed, who later became the station director at Honeysuckle Creek. Well, back to Muchet. This is the team for John Glenn's flight, the flight control team and the trackers all together outside the building at Muchet. They closed in 1963 when Mercury finished because a station further north was needed. And so, of course, after Mercury came Gemini, two-man capsule. And Gemini was to get long-duration flight practice, to learn how to do orbital rendezvous in preparation for the lunar missions. And because of the launch azimuth and the fact that the more orbits you have, the track shifts north, a station further north was needed, and so Carnarvon was established. And I see we have John Swanee, who worked at Carnarvon, on with us. So hi, John. Carnarvon was built to support Gemini and then Apollo, also worked as part of the satellite tracking and data acquisition network. It was a very large station. In fact, it was the largest outside the US, and you can just get a feel for this looking at this panorama of the site. Very widespread, had radar, had telemetry, had ranging, had all sorts of stuff. And the front part of that building there is the Apollo wing, which was added to go with the 30-foot Apollo antenna as well. Here's some footage from 1965 inside the Gemini control room. Thought you might enjoy seeing this. There in the middle, sitting at the console with the white shirt, is Hamish Lindsay, who worked at Honeysuckle Creek and wrote the book Tracking Apollo to the Moon. He's at one of the Gemini consoles. Carnarvon was key for the first US spacewalk, Gemini 4. Ed Findell was the Capcom, and he gave the go for the spacewalk as the spacecraft passed over Carnarvon. Gemini 6 and 7, US rendezvous. Carnarvon had a very important role in the Gemini program. And the 9-meter USB antenna was built for Apollo. So Carnarvon, you could say a lot about that, but even more tracking stations were built. A lot of money was being invested by NASA. And over in the East Coast, Tidbinbilla was built. Tidbinbilla was built as the second deep space station in Australia, number 42. There it is just after opening, and here's the Prime Minister, Bob Menzies, opening it in 1965. This is some footage from around the time of the opening inside the operations area at Tidbinbilla. And there in the foreground is Bruce Window, sitting at one of the receivers, and we'll be hearing from Bruce a little bit later on. Tidbinbilla was key in all of the early planetary missions. They tracked Mariner 4 to Mars and beyond. And this picture was taken after the first track in March 65. Tidbinbilla was the first station to receive signals from Mariner 4 after it was occulted by Mars, and Bruce was on the receiver. And some of these pictures were received. Of course, they were a big shock to everybody. Mars wasn't supposed to look like this. Tidbinbilla also supported Surveyor, and Mike Dinn was there for Surveyor 1, all getting ready for Apollo. Now, with Apollo coming, an extra wing was built to the Tidbinbilla complex, and in the foreground, that area outlined in yellow was the Apollo wing, and electronics and all of the equipment needed was built and put in there to support Tidbinbilla's role in being support for the nearby Apollo station, which at that point had not yet been built, but it would become Honeysuckle Creek. And they were linked together by that microwave tower, giving a link over the mountains. This was the wing in 1969, and then again you can see Bruce on the left-hand side in the middle, and very similar to all of the other Apollo tracking stations with the receivers and everything else. Now, Tidbinbilla today is one of NASA's 3 great deep space network stations, and we've got Glenn Nagel with us tonight, and we can't speak highly enough of Tidbinbilla and what is being done there now. Well, what else? Well, just to mention for completeness, Aurora Valley was established to the southwest of Tidbinbilla in the Canberra region, opened in 1966 to track Earth-orbiting scientific satellites. So again, very different from deep space or manned space. They had multiple antennas, and the first station director was Tom Reed, who'd been at Woomera, and then after this went to Honeysuckle Creek. And then almost lastly, Kubi Creek was established up north of Toowoomba on the edge of the Kubi Creek Reservoir, and there it is in the distance, you can just see it there. It was a transportable ground station, brought up on semi-trailers and put together It was to work as part of the Applications Technology Satellite program. And so Kubi Creek worked on some of the technologies we take for granted. It closed in 1970, was dismantled, taken back to the US, and only about 2 years ago we found that antenna is now in the UK and still being used. They experimented with weather photography. This was a picture taken through ATS-2, and on the bottom right of that picture you can just see Australia. And this might be the very first picture showing all of Australia from space. They experimented with satellite television. That's one of the first pictures they received from Japan. And in June 1967, we had Our World, which is the first global satellite television broadcast. 5 o'clock in the morning. I watched it. It was amazing. And Kubi Creek was the Australian satellite Earth station, which received and sent our contributions out to the world. And we contributed 3 live segments to that broadcast, which was seen right around the world. And one of them was from Parkes, the radio telescope. Now, what's this got to do with Apollo 13? Well, of course, we know Parkes did figure in Apollo 13, but Our World helped us set up the technology. You see, the ABC showed that they could get live television through the microwave links from Parkes to Sydney. And similar arrangements allowed Parkes to serve as an auxiliary antenna for Honeysuckle Creek for Apollo 11, 12, 13, we're thinking of in particular, and later missions as well. So the technologies and the expertise were coming together for the Apollo missions to the moon. In addition to the NASA Manned Spaceflight Network tracking stations at Carnarvon and Honeysuckle Creek and the wing at Tidbinbilla, thousands of Australians were involved in supporting Apollo, and that support was critical during Apollo 13. There was Parkes, of course. There was the Orion, the Apollo Range Instrumented Aircraft, and they were supported in Australia by the Department of Civil Aviation and OTC, providing communications. They allowed coverage of Earth orbit and near Earth orbit parts of the mission from over Central Australia and over the Pacific as well. During Apollo, they staged out of Townsville and Perth. And the OTC, the Overseas Telecommunications Commission, provided high-frequency radio links to the Orion aircraft and satellite and cable links to the USA as well. NASA had a very important switching centre, a NASCOM or NASA Communications Network switching centre in Canberra at the Deakin Telephone Exchange. And a plaque has been produced. I'm not sure if it's there on the building yet, but it's been produced to commemorate that work. And there's Kevin Westbrook in the centre. He was in charge of that very important site. The NASCOM network was huge, and this is just a simplified diagram from around about the time of Apollo 11. Very simplified, but it just gives you an idea of the complexity of this huge NASA communications network. It was the most complex network ever built. And I guess there's only the internet that has really superseded it. So there we are, those stations all around Australia, all paid for by NASA, all staffed by Australians, which is a great advantage to us in learning all sorts of things. And then Honeysuckle Creek, last but not least, as the prime Apollo station, built specifically to support Apollo missions at lunar distances with its 85-foot antenna. This picture was taken a little bit later on. Opened in March 1967. That's a picture taken from the cherry picker. John Saxon went up in that cherry picker on the day. I don't think I'd want to do that. And this picture was taken 2 weeks after Apollo 11. About 100 people worked there during Apollo. These pictures were taken during Apollo 8. Great pictures, these. And at top right, you'll see in the foreground Mike Dinn, and behind him, John Saxon sitting at the operations console. And here they are again, same console just before Apollo 13, when they were simulating a perfect emergency, when only a couple of weeks later they had a real emergency. So that's a bit of background to Apollo 13 and what Australia had in place and what Australia had been doing. So now we find out what actually happened at Honeysuckle Creek. And I'll get out of screen sharing.
Fantastic, Colin. Thank you for that. That was awesome.
Got to work out how to turn this off, sorry. Stop screen sharing. I'll do that in just a second, sorry. And I don't want to cancel the meeting. I don't want to sign in either.
Where you click to start the share, you should be able to click on that again to stop the share.
It doesn't seem to be there. Hang on, I'll just be a moment. And here it is.
There it is.
Screen sharing is stopped.
Done.
Good. Okay, that's right. Well, I'll go away and you can keep talking and I'll just listen.
No worries. Well, thank you for that. So, John Saxon, are you still awake? We'll hand over to John Saxon now. I can't hear you, John, but maybe you got your microphone muted. Oh, there we are.
I'm still here and still.
Here he is. Fantastic.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with you now, and let's see what I can find for you. And what I'm preparing to do is to give you a flavour of the Honeysuckle station. That's all it'll be. I do have other presentations with block diagrams and things, but probably boring as heck for most people. And particularly slides like this first one, which I hope you can see. Peter, can you see that all right?
Yes, John, coming through perfectly.
Okay, great. Can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Yeah, well, this is telling everybody what they already knew, and that is that you need 3 stations around the Earth to give you some coverage, give you continuous coverage of the moon as soon as they're beyond geosynchronous orbit, actually a little bit below that. So this is something that I'm sure you all know. And equally so, these were the 3 stations in a MacKellar projection. And here was Honeysuckle down there, Goldstone, the Mojave, and Madrid, just up in the hills above Madrid, really. Okay, let's move on to something more interesting. This is how they looked in the, here was Canberra up here, Tibbimbilla here, microwave link down to Honeysuckle Creek, and I can't see Aurora Valley on the bottom because I've got all these other things. But never mind, I'm sure they were south of us, considerably further out of town. And there was the microwave link between the two. And there was a repeater up on Deadman's Hill, which was not very far away from the main station. This was opening day, and it was opened by yet another Prime Minister, Harold Holt, who actually, sorry, I went a bit too far on that one. Yes, Harold Holt visited the station after he had opened it officially with a representative from NASA, Siemens, I've forgotten what his Christian name was. Anyhow, that was in 17th of March 1967. The station itself was built mostly in 1966. I arrived there after spending some time in the Network Training Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, which I went to before I actually emigrated out to Australia. So I had to fly from England to Greenbelt to go for the training, which was called the Manned Spaceflight operations supervisor training or something similar. And then I had to fly back to England in order to emigrate down to Australia. And this is a little movie about the opening day.
Picturesque natural surroundings and bearing an equally picturesque name, the Honeysuckle Creek tracking station. Dominated by its saucer-shaped radio antenna, 85 feet in diameter, it's the 6th such station to be constructed in Australia and places this country second only to America as the Western world's most important space tracking country. Prime Minister Holt performs the official opening ceremony. Built by the United States National Aeronautics and Space Administration at a cost of $2 million, Honeysuckle Creek is operated by Australian firms employing homegrown scientists, engineers and technicians. Honeysuckle Creek is virtually an earthbound ear to a man on the moon, being one of 3 stations destined to guide the Apollo project to a manned landing on our nearest space neighbor, scheduled for 1970. Together with the Deep Space Tracking Station at Tidbin Villa, 14 miles to the west, it will play a vital role in the critical final stages of the moon landing. Mr. Holt sets the antenna in motion at the press of a button. Honeysuckle Creek, another step in man's most exciting journey, 250,000 miles into space. Picturesque natural.
So we were duly opened, and more or less the same year or a little bit later, Hamish Lindsay took this picture, which we call the classic honeysuckle picture. It's stood us in good stead for many years. Over on the right here, you can see the tower for the microwave link from the Tidbinbilla station. This was sort of ground plan of rough site plan. Antenna up on the hill, the operations building, and down below was the power generation building, had all the diesel generators, and also many little offices or workshops for electricians, air conditioning people, motor mechanics, huge number of people with skills in those sort of areas. This was the operations building, which was sort of 1.5 stories high, ground level, then up some stairs into the operations room up above. I should just mention that this was it says crew room, but actually it was a cafeteria, and right next, which was a 24/7 operation. And right next door to it was a couple of bedrooms, which were almost impossible to sleep in because of all the noise that came out of the cafeteria 24/7. Anyhow, occasionally you got a few hours. I did sleep on site quite a few times, or tried to. And up here, we've got the main operations area. First of all, the unified S-band area, which is the same as the area at Tidbinbilla, which is the controls for the transmitters, receivers, pointing in the antenna and tracking data, originating and all the rest of it. Next door to it was the telemetry operation area. I've got some pictures of these coming up. We had three decommutators for the spacecraft telemetry data, and the great thing about it was in manned spaceflight you could actually see all the activity that was going on, see all the temperatures, pressures, and many things like the astronaut respiration and heartbeat and stuff like that, which was probably the most important part. Computer area, quite a lot of stuff in the computer area, I'll show you in a minute. And this was my little slot there. Mike Dinn would normally live around here, I think, but during operations he came and sat on the left-hand side of the console there. We had a hatch going through to the communications area so they could pass through teletype messages and this type of thing. And that was called the communications switch room, but it was really the wire room mostly, where all the intercoms, every position had different sets of buttons on it, and they were all wired up in there. I'll move along. This was an early picture of the antenna operator. He had what looks like a bowling ball, but actually it was called a much smaller than a full-size bowling ball. It was actually a duck pin bowling ball. I've never played duck pin bowls, but has no finger holes in it, which was a good thing. And really, what the operator is doing, he can drive the antenna to the acquisition point where we expect the spacecraft to appear, and then once it does appear, it's a sort of a dance between him and the receiver operators. When the receivers are locked up on the spacecraft, then he can select automatic track, and the antenna will then follow the spacecraft. Pretty cunning system, actually, because they had 4 feed horns pointing down the bore side of the antenna. And the whole idea of the servo system was to balance the output of those 4 feed horns, so the antenna was always focused directly on the spacecraft. He's a backup antenna operator. He's now got 2 sons, a bit older than that. It's my young son. And these are receivers. 1 receiver, 2 receiver, 1 exciter console, 1 receiver, 2 receivers, 1 exciter console. The controls for the power amplifiers, transmitters. And there was some chart recorders which were very handy at times to find out what actually happened. This was the ranging equipment. The ranging was interesting subsystem in that this guy was the only guy who really understood it. It was used a system of transmitting a pseudo-random number code. That was a random number code which repeated. So it was called a pseudo-random numbers. And when they were reflected back from the spacecraft, they were compared, and you could measure the spacecraft distance to an accuracy of, I think, 2 or 3 meters at lunar distance. And of course, when you took that over a period of time, you got the velocity of the spacecraft, and so on and so on. Accelerations in all axes in the end. This was 1.5 decommutators in the telemetry area. It's a sort of simulation rack there, but that's one of the decommutators going down here. This is another one. Get all this stuff in one chip in your phone these days, I'm sure. Also, there was 3 of these in the telemetry area, plus TV equipment for when we got TV from the moon, plus recorders, analog tape recorders. This was the computer area. This is actually not all of it. It was about this much over the other side to the left. So there was a lot of gear there. And this was one of the main computers. We had 2 of those, one for telemetry and one for command data. And this item in the middle was called the expanded memory unit. We also had paper tape drives, you name it. And we had two small computers down this end, which we can talk about. That they're really to produce data tapes for driving the antenna along the expected track of the spacecraft, and one for simulations and other purposes. So I'll just give you a little idea. Whoops. Oh, that's a shame. I thought I'd put a slide in there which was to give you a few statistics about those computers. But one of these computers, I can tell you, was, I think, had a 2 microsecond cycle time, had something like, I think it was 16K, or it might have been 32K of 30-bit memory, and lots of input-output channels. There's a lot of parallel computing going on in there, including handling the tape handlers and many other functions. This was the operations console. Now, I should say something about this because basically it was where Mike and I worked. I was lucky enough to do all the Apollo missions there, plus Skylab, plus various other bits and pieces from that console. Excuse me. I should say that around the manned spaceflight network, it was expected that all the equipment would be the same in all the stations, so that when they sent out instructions and all the rest of it, they would know how the stations were laid out and what the controls were and all the rest of it. This console, after Mike Dinn finished with it, bore absolutely no resemblance to any other console in the manned spaceflight network. I think Mike purloined those beautiful analog meters from one of the tracking ships which was being dismantled. We had various status lights showing what the equipment was doing around the station. We both had fairly big intercom panels. They were different because on this side, I was required, if necessary, to talk to the spacecraft and monitor the voice, amongst many other functions. And so, if necessary, you could press a button up there and talk to a spacecraft. But you didn't do it lightly. I never thought I was going to do it at all. It only happened on Apollo 16. On my right there, I'm sorry about the smoking. I gave up straight after that before Skylab. There's 2 panels of 25 buttons, push buttons, computer address matrices, I think they were called. From there, I could control telemetry things like initiating playback and all this sort of stuff. And on the right, there was a command panel which you could send commands to the spacecraft if the circuits to Houston failed or something of that sort, and high-speed printers and various other things. I think maybe the fun thing was this, which is, it seems almost inconceivable these days when you can generate things so easily digitally. But this was the configuration board, which consisted of magnetic letters which you could stick around the place, and nickel elastic, as we called it. You could join things up together, showing signal paths that we wanted. And then that was put around the operations area by a television camera behind our heads up on the right there. So it was a very crude form of telling people what configuration we wanted at any one time. Couple of atmospheric pictures. Could be fun. Hamish Lindsay took both of those pictures, I think, and he nearly got hit by one of those rocks. He went up to get a different camera or something, and another rock had fallen where he was taking the first picture from. This one was when the road actually fell about 300 meters down the hillside after an awful rain. And cars could not come by, of course. Had to open up the new road the old road while this one was being fixed. And I was lucky enough to be on station and spent 3 days tracking some ALSEPs and things like that. And on overtime after the first 8 hours, I think, which was very acceptable. We were paid under the Metal Trades Industry Award, I might add, so the wages weren't the best. We drank a lot of coffee during missions. I put this on because there's a certain movie that talks about a prime minister visiting parks. Actually, it didn't really happen, but here's a real one that visited us on the morning of Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon when we were preparing for it. I was not at all happy. Anyhow, without sound, some ABC footage. And here comes John Gorton and Tom Reed, an ABC reporter. Ian Grant was another deputy station director sitting beside myself. And everybody smoking in our little room. So that was that one. And that was to give you an idea of the sort of TV quality we would see before it got through conversion equipment for American standards and then conversion back to Australian standards and sent over hundreds of kilometers of microwave links. It was considerably worse than that, but we did have a good view if we had time to look at it, which was not that often. This one you've probably seen around the place. It was Neil Armstrong's doing 112 beats per minute when he actually stepped onto the lunar surface. Aldrin was doing 81, probably fuming. And exceeded my time, so I'm just going to carry on here. We had a little bit of graffiti. Lots of people hated running simulations, but by golly, I think it made us one of the best tracking stations in the world because we could run our own simulations instead of relying on the Americans all the time. And just a few nice lunar shots there. And the last one, that immediately draws in the hoax people. They say, look at those 2 lights there, big floodlights. Of course, you have to explain to them very carefully that it's reflections inside the lens because they're getting a bit close to the sun there, as you can see by the shadows. And so that was it. And I'm sorry, I've exceeded my time by 4 minutes.
No problem at all, John. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Is everyone still with us? I think most people are still with us. It's great. Yeah, cool. Mike, we're going to move over to Mike. I'm going to be sharing my screen, but Mike is going to be actually doing the talking. So I will start up and start sharing here and share my screen, and I'll follow Mike's cue as far as going through the slides.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm just starting up the presentation here. And is that all looking good for everyone?
I'm here with me, Peter.
Fantastic. So I'm on your page 1, Mike.
Okay.
Fire away.
Well, I'll do my best to talk to Apollo 13 and our involvement and support in as few slides and words as I can. After Apollos 11 and 12, we really expected just a relatively simple, normal mission. But 13 was a little bit different from our point of view. The Saturn 4B, third stage of the rocket, was targeted for the Apollo 12 seismometer. It was targeted to hit the moon to generate some noise for the Apollo 12 seismometer. And therefore, extra batteries were fitted in the S4B so it could transmit and it be tracked and it to determine its track to the moon, its trajectory. So that was the major difference, which had to have significant implications later on. It was our normal manned spaceflight network. Australia was Honeysuckle, Tidbinbilla. Parkes was not scheduled for this mission, partly because of the relatively short view period, but other reasons. They were going to deploy this umbrella antenna, and I think it had been shown we could get a sufficiently good picture of the astronaut coming down the ladder using Honeysuckle or Tidbinbilla. So Parkes was not scheduled, but of course Carnarvon played a major part, and as Colin said, the Arias were flying out of Australia. And whenever we talk about who's involved, we never forget PMG and OTC. Literally hundreds of unsung heroes around Australia. So next slide, Peter. You've seen this. I just thought I'd use it as something to hang a little bit of administration on. This was taken actually during Apollo 13 sim, as has been said. We did many sims. We came out with Plan B, Plan C, Plan D, and it gave me and all of us, I think, confidence that we could cope with anything. It was slightly unusual. I was Deputy Station Director to Tom Reed at that time, and the policy that had nothing to do with was that a Department Supply deputy would run the station in real time. It's no longer the case, but that was the policy in those days. So I had the joy of being the departmental representative. I was public service, and so I sat in the left seat. John, as you say, sat in the right seat. We worked as a very close team. Either of us would answer to Houston, and we both of us spoke as Honeysuckle. Generally, there were no others spoke out the station except the two of us. I personally come from Tidbinbilla, had experience of surveyor, so that gave me a good grounding in preparation for Apollo. I was sort of parachuted in. I didn't have any training whatsoever, but I got to it fairly quickly. We had a team of somewhere near about getting on for 25 operational people, because all the equipment in that era was analog. Lots of knobs, switches, meters, plugs, all had to be in the right place and had to be operated by skilled, competent, conscientious operators. So everybody there was important. You can never overstate that. In addition to Honeysuckle, we had about 10 people at Tidbinbilla operating similar equipment. And so it was the era of the analog equipment. So next slide, Peter. This, before you roll it, before you sort of play it, Peter. This is the so-called Ben Feast, I don't know, we haven't come up with a shorthand title for it. Apollo in real time. Anybody who has any interest in Apollo and Apollo 13, you really must call up this website. It's got a massive amount of information, but of most direct interest to me and tonight is that we can listen in to our calls to and from Houston, the network position, but often a contact position, and we can hear ourselves, and we end up reinforcing some of the memories we had, but we also found out, I did anyway, some of my memories were really in error. But this is just to give you the flavor of it. This is our very first orbit. If you look up right at the top left, there's a ground elapsed time clock, GET. It's reading 00100 minutes 36 seconds. So this was our first acquisition on the first orbit of Apollo 13. The first person you'll hear up will be John talking, and then followed by me giving an AOS acquisition of signal and a go for command on it.
Network, we got Honeysuckle RTC. RTC, Honeysuckle. You had AOS? That's the negative. Apollo 13, Houston, through Honeysuckle. They don't have acquisition yet, Capcom.
Control GCC, your loop.
Okay, I got side contact. Yeah, come on, understand. Honeysuckle, AOS.
Go ahead, GCC.
How are you?
On this your message.
Honeysuckle, go for command, CSM. How are you? Roger, Honeysuckle. Apollo 13, Houston, through Honeysuckle.
Yeah, I guess that's the only way it's going to get out of here.
Okay, SPN sounds good.
These stations are not in
Honeysuckle, check 30 seconds to dump modulation.
If they are, they won't get it for a while.
Yep.
Honeysuckle, copy.
Hold on a second, let me double check on that.
That's it. Good. Okay, we've got the whole of that pass there. That gives a flavour of what it was like at that time. All was normal. When I could make that call go for command, it's a little bit misleading. What it meant was we were two-way communicating with the spacecraft in terms of voice, up and down, commands up, telemetry down, and tracking data. So that was a typical pass. Everything went, okay, moving right along, everything went along quite well until the explosion at GET 5553. You'll find everybody who has anything to do with Apollo talks about GETs. At the time this occurred, we were pre-pass. We were getting ready for the pass, but I just happened to have come on shift and I heard the call in the background, Houston, we've got a problem, and kept a fairly close ear on. So at that time, it was in the California Goldstone station's view, and they went into the LEM lifeboat. So the next thing that happened after that was that the LEM was powered up, and this is a short recording of Goldstone as they acquired the lunar lifeboat for the first time. So you can play this, Peter.
Goldstone, AOS, LEM. Roger, Goldstone. We have a lock on low bit rate, LEM. Guam application, AOS, LEM. Roger, Guam. Goldstone Network, Goldstone.
Are you able to stay with the LEM frequency okay?
13 Houston, and we've got AOS on the LEM here. That looks right. Okay. Houston contact, Goldstone contact, net 2.
Houston contact.
I have backup voice very weak from the 2 10-foot antenna.
Roger, thank you. Roger.
That works, track.
Track network.
Stand by.
Network contact. Go ahead. You hear Goldstone's report? We got it. Okay.
Okay, so there you are, LEM power up. Houston then quickly transferred. We were in view this time, but we weren't directly involved. They'd handed over the IU, the instrument unit, the third stage of the rocket to Honeysuckle, so that Goldstone could concentrate on the LEM. But the next major event then is the CSM being powered down, or the CSM being powered down. So if we can play that, Peter.
All stations, network, if you haven't already copied it, the CSM is powered down.
So So they powered down the command module to save the batteries. The only power that they had, other than the lunar module, was in batteries on the CSM, which obviously had to be preserved for the re-entry phase. So next slide, Peter. This is the instrument unit. You can see up towards the top a little red ring marked IU. I gather this was all fitted out by IBM. The main thing it carried, the main thing that reflected on us was it had an S-band, our tracking frequency transmitter or transponder, transmitter receiver. And that's the thing that allowed that particular unit to be tracked, and in particular tracking the third stage to the moon. But the big problem was it transmitted on the same frequency as the lunar module, 2282.5 megahertz. And so we had problems. So going to the next slide. This is just to be able to talk around the RF problems. 2282.5 was the nominal center frequency. The lunar module transmitted its telemetry on a 1024 subcarrier and voice on 1250 kilohertz subcarrier. The IU did the same thing. It didn't have a voice subcarrier, of course, so the spectrums were the same, the frequencies were the same. And so from a receiver operator point of view, if you took lock onto the lunar module or lock onto the IU, it was almost impossible to do. And I don't know, well, it was achieved in varying ways, which I'll come to in a moment. But it needed a lot of skilled operators. And it meant that we had to cope with a very, very non-standard situation. We'd never had anything like it before. Next slide, Peter. I can tell you almost as much as I know about this in about 5 words. The whole of the tracking business, uplink and downlink, depended on a thing called a phase lock loop. You could lock, it allows an oscillator to lock to an incoming signal with great precision. So the station transmitter was locked to a precision frequency standard of very high stability, transmitted at 21.01 megahertz nominally. The spacecraft locks to that incoming signal, where you can see input. It then multiplies it by 240 over 221. This is some figure that was traditionally used for transponders. So the input is multiplied by 240, 221, and then transmitted back to the ground at 2282. The ground receiver takes out that 240 over 221, and the difference is the Doppler shift on the transmit and receive frequencies. That is needed that provides great precision for calculating trajectories. So anyway, to cope with this LEM-IU problem, and there's a very good summary on the next slide, Peter. This is written out by a good friend of ours, Bill Wood from Goldstone. I don't think I'll read it through quickly. A background about how the Apollo transponders worked. When the transponders are not locked to an uplink from the tracking network, the downlink goes back to a rest frequency. To acquire the transponder, the uplinking station sweeps its transmitter until it captures the transponder. And then it declares the sweep and locks it to the frequency synthesizer for normal tracking. But when Goldstone Prime and Goldstone Wing were both uplinking at the same time, while both the IU and the LEM were locked together. So when the Goldstone Wing station uplink to the IU was turned off, both transponders locked to the Goldstone Prime uplink. The only way the two transponders could be separated was to have the LEM turn off its S-band transponder. And when that was done, they could separate them. However, it was quite a mess, and we knew what we were trying to do, but we really didn't know how to do it very well. And I like that bit that Bill's put in bold at the end. The process was completed over Honeysuckle after the handover from Goldstone. So it was quite a task. But anyway, we did cope. Along the way in all of this, Chris Kraft at Houston, or somebody, called me and said, hey, can we get parked up? And I said, hey, no, you can't have parked. It's not scheduled. It's impossible. It takes several weeks to configure it and staff it and microwave links. So, well, we really do need it. Mr. Kraft will be talking to your director. So there was quite an effort in making this happen. And what I'll do, Peter, at this point is turn it over to Bruce Window, who was from Tidbinbilla and led the effort for parks. So over to you, Bruce.
Thank you. Hello, Peter, am I on?
Bruce, yes, you're on. I can hear you. I've got the park slide up. I don't know whether you can see it. And I've also got, there's a slide there with a video which I can run for you.
Thanks. Thanks, Mike. Just to recap a little bit about where I came from, you did give me, Peter, a bio very briefly, thank you. Those early years with NASA at Minitrack at Woomera introduced me to the space tracking business, even though it was only on relatively VHF at 136 meg. When I left weapons research in 1964 and I got a job at Tidbinbilla as an RF technician, I was exposed to the next generation of tracking equipment with JPL's S-band system, that's Jet Propulsion Laboratory S-band system, which was later used by the Manned Spaceflight Network for Apollo. I tracked Mariner 4, as Colin mentioned, and after 6 months, I was promoted to be the operations supervisor for a shift. I worked with Mike on all 7 Surveyor missions, and when Apollo Manned Spaceflight Network needed Tidbinbilla as the second 85-foot dish in the Australian sector, as Colin showed, a whole new operations wing was built at Tidbinbilla. An enormous amount of equipment modification was done to allow the front end of the system, let's say the dish, the microwave, the transmitting equipment, to be switched from deep space mode to manned space flight mode. In addition, to cover the 24 hours operationally, 2 USB supervisors were created. Both came from the deep space side of things. That was myself and Tony Keeler, who I'd worked with at Woomera. We operationally responded just to Honeysuckle as a front end, the same as their front end guys were. I did Apollo 6 through 11 at Tidbinbilla. For Apollo 12, as was mentioned, they were going to have the astronauts put up a foldable dish to get good television to Earth. But when the astronaut was positioning the camera, he accidentally pointed at the sun, and that fixed the camera completely. And so we were at Parks as a team, just to essentially do receive only of telemetry and voice. As was mentioned, Apollo 13 was not seen to be a mission that Parks would be involved in. So I was at Tidbinbilla on shift and listening to the intercom nets, and I heard the issue about they have a problem. At the time, the explosion occurred. 2 hours later, I wasn't quite aware of the phone call to Mike, but my chief engineer came in and said, I need you to get the Apollo 12 team to fly up to Parkes. We've got to staff it and get it up. You have to get it home, get yourself some clothes, enough for 2 or 3 days, we're not sure, and get to the airport in Canberra, and there's going to be a little plane that's going to fly you up to Parkes. So we had an hour's travel from the tracking station to get back into town. We all did get a few clothes and ended up down at Canberra Airport. The plane that we were put in was a small one. I remember it clearly. It had a prop at the front and a prop at the back. I wasn't really sure that that was a good idea, having a, you know, what looked like to be a transmission thing through the centre of the plane, but I wasn't sure how it worked. Anyway, we flew late in the afternoon, and we were expected to be able to land at the airstrip at Parkes Dish, which is a very rudimentary strip. But when we got there, it was dark, and while the CSIRO had some cars showing lights on where the pilot should land, he decided it was too dangerous, and so we landed at Parkes an aerodrome, proper strip. By that time, when we got down, it was realised that we didn't have no transport. So the CSIRO dashed some cars down to the airport and transported us the 20k north to the Dish. In the meantime, the CSIRO director, Dr. John Bolton, had been listening to the network and had initiated some change straight away in anticipation. He got his RF engineer, David Cook, to change the equipment in the focus cabin at the tripod of the Dish. And can you show my first slide, please, Peter? Being on a phone, I can't see everything, so I'll assume it's there. On the left of that slide is what was called the offset feed horn. In the center is the feed horn for the focus of the Dish. In the background, underneath some plastic wrapping, was the JPL front end, which had been supplied earlier, I think, for Apollo 11. That went down to the control room, which I can get Colin to, get Peter to flip to the next slide. There we are. That's one of two only pictures taken inside the Dish for Apollo 13. I'm in a white shirt, leaning over the intercom, trying to get predictions for pointing the Dish and for RF acquisition. The gentleman at the left standing up at the door, that's Dr. John Bolton. The guy behind me with his arms folded is the late Jack Dickinson, the great receiver operator. Closest to the camera is the late Neil Fox, the antenna driver. And the guy with his hands on his head is Peter Stewart. He was the data demods technician. So there we are, really in a scramble to get accurate prediction, and within 5 hours of us having left Tidbinbilla, we had acquired the LEM. And even though we only did 6 minutes or 7 minutes of tracking before we reached the horizon for the Parkes Dish, we'd had a 30-degree limit because it was really a scientific instrument, not a manned spaceflight type thing from horizon to horizon. So we only had voice lines. And I can remember we were putting out voice, LEM voice, but I had the data cable in my hands and I was saying, I can't get rid of this XYZ stuff. And it was a frustration. However, after we had set, the PMG did a magnificent job overnight. They got a microwave link to cover the 15 or 16 Ks that was missing, and that operationally for our next pass. Over the following 3 days, it became rather routine for us, but it was interesting to listen to the down voice, which came straight out of the demods there. I could hear the tension in their voices. I could hear them say how cold and miserable they were. I think the temperature was in the 30°F area. Anyway, Park's 210 foot dish was definitely better than an 85 foot dish, but not as much as you would expect. The wing at Tidbinbilla had a maser, cryogenically cooled. As you saw from the photograph, the Park's equipment at the front end was just at ambient temperature. While we were in Park's, we never really knew whether we were good or not so good or bad. I guess we would have been told if we were bad. But it was interesting to see how the CSIRO were so efficient. They were great. They looked after us really well. They provided us with emergency on-site accommodation, and we stayed on site for those next 3 days. I've found out more from Ben Feist's marvellous Apollo 13 MOCA recreation, which has been shown, than I knew about having been there. As a tracker, I have listened to that recreation with interest to find out why they asked us to do things. I was also very interested to see what was the unscrambling of the IU lunar module confusion, because I'd left in the middle of that. I was also interested to get assessments of Parks, which I never really got, or I don't remember getting them. So with that, I made an Excel spreadsheet so far as 2 sheets. I was just interested to document as much as I could of just before the explosion, right through that confusing period up until when Parks acquired, after Parks had set, and went through to Honeysuckle setting. And I did the next day as well. This, I think, Colin and Mike will use more than I will. But in summary, I think that my involvement with Apollo 13 was being part of a team that provided NASA with an emergency receiving facility of the greatest sensitivity in the Australian sector. And it's given me a lot of satisfaction to know what we did and that we helped. And I've been called on a few times to recount issues at Parks, and the BBC did a series which you might have caught. Anyway, thank you. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Bruce. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. I'll hand back to Mike. Did you want me to play that segment that's highlighted here with the, I believe it's the acquisition of...
Yes, Peter, it's just me responding to Houston saying that Parks is finally pointing. It's not that long, so if you could roll that one, please.
Stand by, caller.
Yeah, just a click on the image sometimes works. Oh, you had it. Oh, well,
I did have it. There we go.
there we go.
parts are required S-band. We don't yet have the voice circuit configured.
Roger, understand. Keep us advised.
Welcome.
Okay, that was me telling that Parks should be up in about 15 minutes. So pressing right along, I'm just going to comment. We've got an eminent joiner just come in, Peter.
I'm already here.
Well, even more eminent than you, Joe Kerwin is online.
Welcome.
Joe was the Capcom for most of this mission. Anyway, I'll press on with my slides, and we may get into see if we can get into talk later on. So, going right along, we the network, we got over that IU-LEM problem when the S4B hit the moon. And by the by, if you Google Apollo 13's booster impact, you'll find a fascinating LRO, a recent lunar reconnaissance orbiter picture, and the seismic results from Apollo 12, if anybody's interested in that. So when the command module was shut down, all we had to do was cope with the LEM, which was fairly straightforward, but it was on low power. They turned off the power amplifier, and the antenna switching had to be done by the crew on, well, both cues from the Earth, and I suppose they were watching some sort of uplink signal. How they coped with that, I don't know. I'm also a bit surprised there wasn't ground commanding of that antenna, but I don't think there was. Anyway, eventually, after swinging around the moon and returning to Earth's vicinity, there were several major events. Firstly, the service module was separated from the command module at a GET of about 138 hours. I'm not too sure why it wasn't ejected earlier, because it was literally useless. But in discussing this with Col earlier today, it's quite possible that Houston didn't have a model of a lunar module attached only to a command module without a service module. Anyway, that was ejected and separated at 138 hours. The command module was powered up. Oh, by the way, after that separation, I think that's when they get that famous picture of the whole side being blown out, which we showed earlier. Then the command module was powered up at 140 hours with Carnarvon in view two-way, and Honeysuckle was in view, and Guam. Guam is north. As it was coming back to the Earth, the tracking moved from tracking east to west to tracking west to east. And so this particular track you can see here came to pass. The LEM separated from the command module at 141.30, but it kept on radiating and we tracked it. And so in the latter part of the mission, as you can see from this map, Honeysuckle and Tidbinbilla were tracking the crewed command module and the abandoned lunar module. There was a very interesting way the lunar module was going to go, because it was carrying RTGs, radioisotope thermal generators. And so we tracked both. And I've got, I think the next slide, Peter, includes the audio. Oh, look who's up on the top left there.
Looks just the same these days, I hear.
Mr. Kerwin.
I'll play that, Mike.
Say again?
Will I play that?
Yes, play this, please. And you'll hear me calling the final LOS of CSM and LEM.
Honeysuckle LOS LEM.
So that's the last we hear of the LEM.
Honeysuckle track, azimuth, please.
Stand by.
Flight network. No network. Honeysuckle head final LOS on LEM. Okay. Procedure check.
Go ahead, take with 7 and 9. Honeysuckle unable to command CM.
Roger, Honeysuckle.
Honeysuckle final LOS CM.
Flight network, final LOS from Honeysuckle. Right. Orion control network, connect 2.
Probably at that point.
Orion 2, carry on and 2 o'clock.
Cover. Okay.
So that was the last of our tracking. And we at Honeysuckle, and for some reason, Tom Reed had come over to Honeysuckle at that time, and everybody went home, and it was all quiet. We were doing this re-entry, just hearing no sound, and we didn't hear any riot traffic, and we were a bit concerned. We didn't hear a thing, Tom and I. So Tom rang his wife, Margaret, Senator Margaret Reed, and said, well, Margaret, we don't know what's happening. We're a bit afraid. And she says, I'm watching it all on television. She was watching the actual splashdown on television. We couldn't do that at Honeysuckle, by the way. We didn't have TV capability. So you can play the next one, Peter.
Ramp 4, drop out as band. Edward, Houston TV.
Go ahead.
It's there.
Yes.
Visual contact, flag.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great. Got you on television, Dave. Visual. Bring it.
Capcom from flight. Gugino Control, this is Web 2. I think the recovery forces got him there. 182. English, Roger.
Right, you can turn that off, Peter. And that was Ed Tarkington you heard here. The Houston TV man saying the first to see. And so finally, Peter, the splashdown one, play this one. The comms, by the way, are all now HF shipped, so they're not quite S-band anymore. There you go. Last slide, and next slide, Peter.
Is that the same one?
Photo 1's on station. Photo 1 observes splice down at this time. On pickup parity. Roger. Photo 1 splice down at this time. The three chutes are displaced in the water.
Is that the same slide, Mike?
That's it. That's it, Peter. And just a quick picture signed off there by Fred. And finally, a couple of recognitions. If you can put the next one up, Peter, please. This is a statement by the Minister of Supply while they're on the way. I'll just read the last paragraph. I'd like to pay special tribute to the staff of Honeysuckle Creek and Tidbinbilla, who, working at the lowest possible signal levels, have been providing comms between the ground and the astronauts. I'm certain I speak for all Australians in wishing the Apollo crew a safe return to Earth, having mentioned AWA, PNG, and STC above. And next one, Peter. And here's a letter from the ambassador to Secretary of Prime Minister's Department from Nixon to Gorton. And on behalf of the people of the United States, I express my help and so on. Safe recovery of the astronauts, we're profoundly thankful. Next slide, Peter. Convey my personal thanks to all who worked so hard to maintain communications. Involvement in Apollo 13 was an instance of close cooperation between our countries, signed Richard Nixon. And then there's one from Tom Paine as well. Next one, Peter. They mentioned Sparks up there, signed off by the Deputy Chief of Mission. The ambassador was out of town at the end. So there you go. That was Apollo 13 as seen by us. And I'm just wondering at this point, Peter, whether we could ask Joe Kerwin if he's got any comments. Joe was the Capcom for most of this mission. He was the NASA representative here in Canberra in the early 80s. He came out to our 20th anniversary on Apollo 11. So if you'd like to turn off your sharing and see if you can turn on Joe.
Am I turned on?
There you go. Can hear you, Joe.
How you doing, Mike?
Well.
Welcome.
Well, thank you. Of course, a ton of memories come up. One of the memories was just sitting at the Capcom console for hours during the return flight, listening to static, leaning over with my head in my hands, listening to the static of the low power S-band, waiting to hear the crew call. And when we heard the crew, we responded, and they would go to high gain for a while to communicate, and then go back to S-band. They were so short of power that they had to turn everything off, as you know. And how in the world they controlled attitude during their burns during that time still amazes me. I think it had to do with Jim Lovell having been on the crew of Apollo 8, and on Apollo 8, they never needed a backup way of controlling spacecraft attitude without their IMU, without their guidance system. But they thought through it, and thought through an idea that if they could swing the spacecraft so that the edge of the Earth was in a certain position in the window, the attitude would be satisfactory for a burn. Fantastic stuff. Of course, I remember particularly the re-entry sequence, and my principal memory of that is, let's see where we go with it. They had separated the service module from the command module, and Jack Swigert duty in the relatively few minutes left before entry interface was charged with using the telescope and sextant in the command module to get accurate attitude. And he couldn't find two stars. And the reason he couldn't, the limb was still attached, and sunlight was reflecting into the optics from the limb, and the stars were extraordinarily difficult to find. And I'm sitting there at the Capcom console just listening, and Gene Kranz is standing up there behind me, and the clock is ticking away and ticking away. And I'm looking up at Gene saying, "Let's get on with it, Gene. We gotta go. And he just glanced down. Of course, I didn't say that. He just glanced down at me and gave me this little wave of the hand saying, give him a minute, give him another minute. And pretty soon Swigert said, 5 balls, which meant that his star angle difference was 0.0000. He had made it. We had the alignment, and on through to entry. And then the things went pretty well from there, amazingly. By the way, I was sitting next to Ken Mattingly for reentry. Ken, of course, was the assigned command module pilot for Apollo 13. And the discovery had been made just several days before launch that one of the backup crewmen had a family episode of German measles and was found to be susceptible to German measles. They tested everybody on both the prime and the backup crew and found that Ken Mattingly, who did not have the measles, was susceptible. He had not contracted it during childhood and didn't have immunity. So the crew was called into Chris Kraft's office. Chris was the director of the center at that time. And for some reason, they asked me to come along, and I came along and sat there, and Dr. Berry talked through what they had done to assess immunity and why he thought that Ken should come off the crew and be replaced by Jack Swigert. I'm thinking through all this and looking at the faces of the prime crew, especially Lovell, and thinking how long they had trained together for what was really a pretty difficult mission. And I spoke up. I said, I don't agree, Dr. Kraft, with Dr. Berry's assessment that the German measles is a serious illness and that Ken should be removed from the crew. And Kraft turned and looked at me as though from 1,000 miles away and said, that wasn't Dr. Berry's decision. That was my decision. And I shrunk to a height of 6 inches and felt like scurrying out the door. That was a tough time. He made a tough decision. And of course, Jack did a great job. But it was dramatic. And by the way, Ken never got the measles. Ken was essential. He was one of the truly essential people in the mission control and at the center during this time, because as soon as they got the free return burn done and realized that one of the major problems was going to be having less than 3 hours of electricity left in the reentry batteries on the command module, and therefore had to get the command module going from a frozen lump to a fully operational spacecraft in less than 3 hours to make that reentry possible. Ken Mattingly went over to the simulator and spent just about all of the time between then and reentry going through and building that square zero checklist that started with a dead machine. The temperature that I remember hearing was 38 degrees. It was really cold in there. There was moisture everywhere. The team with Ken as the commander in the simulator built it up, tested it, built it up, tested it. And all this time was growing short. And Jim Lovell was getting testy. And he was saying more than once, I've got to have that checklist, you people. I've got to look it over. Swigert has to look it over. We have to check the switches. Get it up there. And we'd look at flight and the several copies of the newly printed checklist, and it was read up to the crew. We were all sort of absolutely amazed that every system on that spacecraft worked beautifully as it was powered up. And that brought another memory back to the tragic Apollo fire of January '67, I think it was, when we'd had the fire in the command module during pre-launch checks down at the Cape and killed the crew. And one of the very many things that was done after that was to go through all the wiring in the command module and put in an extra layer of potting to make it absolutely waterproof, as well as step-proof from walking on it. And it had to be that that activity that made the command module able to get powered up like that. So it was wonderful. We went on into reentry, and of course we went into blackout, and I don't remember exactly what the time figured for blackout was, but it was fairly short. And after that time passed, I got the nod, and I said, Apollo 13, Houston, standing by. No answer. 30 seconds. Standing by, Houston, standing by. And the atmosphere in mission control during that minute when we didn't get contact changed from one of relaxation and happiness back to that very, very tense, what's going on? Have we lost him after all? And then suddenly we heard, okay, Joe, from Jack Swigert. And that was about the time the chutes came out and got visible, and that's when we really relaxed and quite soon, unplugged our microphones and went home.
Well,
Wow.
my kid, Joe, glad you made it. Was there any particular time during the rest of the mission, apart from re-entry, when you weren't too sure they would make it?
Oh, going to the first meeting that I recall were after the free return burn. Gene Kranz was in charge, and the control team briefly reported what their problems were. And best I can recall, it was a list of problems long as your arm. It seemed like some of them may not have been susceptible to being solved. They were way over in power. The electrical power wasn't going to last. The entry batteries had been used a little bit before they powered the command module down, and there was less than 3 hours left. So power was a big one. Water was another one, cooling water for the lunar module, and that kind of went with power. So if you powered down, you wouldn't need as much water. Oxygen was going to be okay, although they didn't think so right at the start, because they could use the oxygen in the spacesuits as well as the reentry tank in the command module. The other big one, which I was involved in a little bit later, was carbon dioxide. There weren't enough lithium hydroxide canisters in the LEM to scrub the CO2 out of the atmosphere with all 3 of the crew members being there for an extended period of time. We were going to get to toxic levels. We were going to get to very toxic levels if something wasn't done. Well, the Crew Systems Division, which managed that particular subsystem, got right to work. And hours went by, and pretty soon again that left-hand door opened, and here comes the Crew Systems guys with a great big cardboard box full of stuff. And they came right and parked in front of the Capcom console and said, okay, Kerwin, we're going to teach you how to do this, and then you're going to teach Swigert. So we got down on our hands and knees and went through the checklist and handled the equipment, the tubes from the suit and the plastic and the checklist pages and all the stuff they needed. And it wasn't that complicated. Lots of great tape. Pretty soon I declared I was ready, and then called up Jack and said, Jack, we're going to fix the carbon dioxide problem, but before we start, I have a list of equipment that I want you and the other guys to go and find and identify, and then bring it back, and we'll run through the procedure. And Jack said, well, okay, in a tone of voice that sounded like he didn't believe this was going to work. I sort of felt like a third grade teacher telling the little kids to go get their scissors and crayons. Turned out that he, with help from the other crew members, just put that thing together splendidly and hooked it up, and within minutes, almost seconds, you could see the CO2 come down from over 15, which is up in emergency territory, down to less than 2. And that problem got solved. So it was one problem after another. They thought about shortening the trip home by jettisoning the service module early and just coming home with the command module, which would have saved them several hours. Rockwell said no. Rockwell said they appreciated the advantages, but the disadvantage was that the heat shield on the command module would be exposed to extremely cold temperatures for a long time, and they were not sure that it wouldn't crack and fail during reentry. So that was reluctantly disposed of, and they managed to save enough resources to get the guys home with a little bit to spare.
It sounds like a good story for a movie, Joe.
Yeah, let's pick out the stars, right?
What did you think of the movie, Joe? It sounded, from your description, fairly accurate.
I thought it was a great movie, despite the fact that the cast of the real Mission Control was too big, and when you're writing the movie, you always have to combine some of the functions into one actor, and they combined me into Ken Mattingly, and had Ken be the Capcom for reentry as well as the guy doing the work. And in fact, there was a suggestion that Ken replace me as Capcom, and Ken spoke up. This was an hour before reentry, and said, "Nope, Kerwin is the Capcom. I'm just going to sit behind him and listen." And so the two of us sat side by side during entry. And as I said before, I consider Ken to have been one of the heroes, the guy who didn't make the flight, but the guy who helped them come home. So that was very special.
So are you going to write a book then, Joe?
Well, yeah. Well, Lovell took care of that, didn't he? And
I think you've got plenty to very much unique knowledge, and I'm very pleased you showed up tonight. I didn't really expect you, but it's great to have had you join us.
It's a thrill for me to join you guys because I achieved such respect during my time in Australia for you, the teams that managed the Deep Space Network, and I was sent over there as the so-called NASA liaison, but you guys didn't need a NASA liaison. All you needed was to be left alone and appreciated and given a little funding from time to time. And it all worked beautifully. So it was a privilege for me to live in Australia and to meet you and watch you work, learn a little about Deep Space Network.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real honor to have you here. And I speak for everybody. Thank you so much for everything you did. And we might have you back again because you had your own space flight a couple of years later, didn't you, with Pete Conrad? And we'll have to pick you up again.
And Paul Weitz and
Paul
Scott.
Weitz.
Of course, we didn't go to deep space, but our 50th anniversary will be in 2023. And if I make it for 3 more years, which I intend to do, let's have a party.
You've got it locked in. You have to be there, Joe. We want you there. Okay. Eat well and live well and stay safe and isolated for a little while anyway.
I shall. Thank you very much for having me.
Please don't feel like you have to hang up. I think we're just about finished anyway, Mike.
Yes, I have, and I joined in the privilege of having Joe join us. He's got a lot of unique background, and those of you who are going to go back and watch Apollo in real time, hour after hour after hour, you'll see and hear a great deal of Joe in that.
No, I'm going to run get a cup of coffee and then just come sit down and enjoy the show.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Enjoy that. Well, Mike, there's a couple of options here. We're probably running a little bit over time anyway. would you like to have a poke around the Apollo in real time page, or would you like me to run the extended interview that I did with Fred Hayes this morning?
I think we should leave the feast page for now. I don't think we can equate anything after Joe there. No, I think it'd be appropriate now for you to roll the Fred myself. Oh, someone's saying, what about a Q&A? I don't quite know how you're going to handle that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we do have a bunch of questions. That's a good idea, yes. So I don't know whether you can see them, Mike and Colin and John and Bruce. Let's see if I can see any questions that you might want to attack. If anyone's got one, if you can pop it into the chat box. I can't see a one at this point, but
or unmute and speak, perhaps, Peter.
Yes, they can go ahead and unmute themselves as long as you don't swear. You'll be okay. Has anyone got a question?
Oh, I see that question down the bottom.
Oh yes, okay.
Anyone been to Honeysuckle Creek since the fire? No, not physically, I don't think. Although someone, I gather, went up there sort of unofficially. There is a video, mind you, that was taken after the fire went through, which was online for a while. I don't know if Glenn or John or anybody has been to Honeysuckle since the fire.
No, I haven't been back up there yet. The roads were closed off for a very long time. I think whoever took that movie, I think it was probably Brett McNamara, who's the manager of the Namadgi National Park. And they did a marvelous job to save that. It actually burnt through the station area there, and some of the plants that they planted suffered from that, but other than that, it's in good shape, and so is Aurora.
If Joe's back, he's got a marriage proposal in the chat box there, so if you'd like to move to Tasmania, and that's a definite offer on the table from Tina. Is Joe back? I'm not sure.
Gone for his coffee, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, David, you asked about the Q&A. Do you have a question? David Boyd.
Yeah, hi. Look, it's a general question, not specific to Apollo 13, but I've never ever understood why we had 3 tracking stations in the ACT vicinity, where it seems to be provide no geographic advantage and very inefficient. I know that tracking stations serve different purposes, deep space versus near space in some cases, but I was always curious as to why create such a duplicated set of infrastructure where it could have all been combined into one and ultimately was.
I think you could say that it was originally the fact that there were 3 different tracking networks which were independent of each other to a large extent. Eventually, of course, the Honeysuckle antenna was moved to Tiboombilla and Honeysuckle closed. The Aurora Valley 26-metre antenna was moved down outside Hobart for radio astronomy, where it's still in use.
Yeah, I'll jump in there a second, John.
Sure.
The Stadan, which was at Island Lagoon, was moved to Aurora Valley. That was why there was Aurora. All the stuff that was Minitrack was moved to Aurora, and they built an 85 to complement that station. That was the reason for Aurora.
And Mike here, there were 3 pretty distinct activities going off all at the same time in the glorious. Yeah. It's all the Earth orbiting stuff, which was very busy. And we all were tracking 30 and 40 spacecraft a day. Tidbinbilla was fully occupied with all the deep space missions, and Honeysuckle, of course, with the manned flight. Also, the technologies were a little bit different here and there. The frequencies used, the transmission rate, and the speed. I mean, the deep space antennas only need to move quite slowly, but your Earth orbit ones need to go horizon to horizon in a few minutes. So there was diversity and support needed in that era, and plenty of dollars.
I've just been asked, apparently there's a function you can raise your hand that brings you to the attention of us, so we can flip over to you to hear your question. I don't know how to do that, but I'm just going to take a picture of yours.
Joe is back. He's got his coffee.
Oh, Joe, while you're away, you had a marriage proposal, by the way, from Tina Stagg. She's in Tasmania. Don't let your wife find out. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Doesn't look like it. So with that, I might go ahead and run this video of the interview of Fred Hayes. It goes to about 35 minutes. The first part of it is about 2 minutes of that I played at the start of the presentation, which some may or may not have seen. But the rest of it is nice. I apologise for the video quality. Fred's room's not particularly well lit, but
Pete.
Yeah.
Before you go to that, there is a question from. I'm just looking for it.
From Bill.
Yeah, from
that was me actually, and Mike Dinn and John Saxon know me really well from here from Canberra. I've been doing some emails to Mike, makes these interruptions, and he'll have a pile of emails to answer me tomorrow. But one fundamental one, listening to that Apollo real time, a significant difference in the loudness of the American conversations versus the Australians, which really makes it very hard for me to listen to Mike Dinn and recognise his voice. And I wonder whether there was a technical reason for the difference in the amplitude.
We could spend an hour on that, Bill, on levels. It depends which buttons the people were pressing, the controllers and Capcom and the like were pressing at the time, as to what level it got recorded at. And then when you think of all the level adjustments that have gone off over the last 50 years and the like, it's pretty amazing that they're anywhere near equal. In fact, I think the people who put those tapes together spend a fair bit of time trying to equalize them. I don't know if anybody else got any other comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, mate. We'll talk over a cup of coffee next time we get together.
I should add that all these levels on the communications channels have been set up by the mafia, of the comms mafia, and they have calibrated eardrums, and they can tell which is correct and which isn't. So we had to put up with that to a certain extent, although we did tend to cut them off if they misbehaved too much.
There was one very popular phrase used by the communications people in that era. It's all right leaving us. Whenever we went trying to trace comm problems, you go down the comm line and for sure someone along the way is going to say, it's all right leaving us.
Fantastic. Wonderful. All right. I can't see any other hands raised or questions. So, hang on. John, is it? John Mario? I've got a hand up there, or a clap, is it?
Peter, it's Bruce. I think I'll drop off and say goodnight.
No worries, Bruce. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time and effort, and thanks for all the things you've done.
Cheerio.
Look forward to meeting you in person sometime.
For sure. Good night.
All right, you take care of yourself in isolation there.
Me too, Peter. Sorry, way past my bedtime.
No worries. For those who are leaving, this whole thing is recorded, so we're going to upload the whole thing to our YouTube channel. So if you go to space,
can start.
Please go ahead and start.
Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Fred Hayes, Apollo 13 from the States. Wishing I could be closer, even in person, for the celebration 50th anniversary, since we flew that mission back in 1970. Kind of auspicious with the current circumstances we have around the world. Our mission in the week before our flight had a great challenge and threat of a virus. We had all been exposed by Charlie Duke, who had gone to a birthday party with his son, to German measles, which is a virus, although I'll have to say not near as threatening as the one the world is dealing with today. Nevertheless, though, it caused us within the crew a traumatic incident. We were all exposed, and through the blood work and testing, it was determined that Ken Manningly, the primary crew command module, which Jim Lovell and I had worked with through a previous whole crew assignment, Apollo 11. We were the backup on Apollo 11. And here we were already going 13, and Ken was replaced. The decision was made 2.5 days before our launch that Jack Schweigert would replace Ken. So that was a very traumatic decision, and kind of took away for me a little bit of the excitement of going with that, just seeing how distraught that was. I knew for Ken to have worked that hard to get to this point and then be pulled off at the last minute. But anyway, just should have known then that Apollo 13 wasn't going to be exactly the normal mission.
So Ken ended up flying on Apollo 16 and had quite a good space career. He ended up doing a deep spacewalk, which wasn't planned on 13. So I guess out of everybody, he was the big winner. Would you agree?
I would agree. I think Ken is not. He really still feels like he wished he'd have been on the mission. He of course served well on the ground where he worked in the special teams that Gene Kranz had set up, particularly with a development of a procedure to turn on the command module. Because since the mothership, the command module was never intended to be turned off ever in flight. There was no procedure on how to turn it on. Normally it was turned on the launch pad with a lot of people involved in support equipment. And so this was the first time ever it was going to have to be turned on the fly. And literally it had to be a great procedure because they didn't turn Jack Schweigert and I on to activate that vehicle until 2.5 hours before entry. So we were sitting there in this cold, dark spacecraft, knowing we're going to enter in 2.5 hours, and now had to power this thing up and hope it would work well.
Right. So I'm just curious, as I mentioned before, we do have a number of the Australian tracking station staff on our session today. Did you have any awareness at the time of the global tracking network and the various stations, and do you recall at all during the flight, I suppose you were so busy, any interactions or awareness of Honeysuckle Creek, of Parks, of Tidbinbilla and those sites?
No, I'd have to say I did not. The only thing I knew that something other than normal had been done was as part of the power saving on board to make this 2-day landing craft last 4 days, was we did not turn on our power amplifier. Normally that might have gotten low bit rate, I guess, from the lunar distance, but probably would have not got high bit rate, and certainly not TV when they had the bandwidth for TV. But I suspected that something different was being done on the ground to make sure they got high bit rate data.
So you may or may not be aware of this, and I probably won't explain it very well, but one of the challenges that I experienced was the transmitter on the Saturn third stage, which was kind of traveling in parallel with you, was frequency transmitting on the same as the lunar module,
right,
which in the normal circumstances wouldn't be a problem, but in your mission it was. So they had to spend time trying to separate the signals out, which was quite a lot of work done in Australia and other parts of the world to make that happen. So I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I, of course, was not aware of that. I knew we were having some communication problems, but I was not aware of the exactly why. I assumed it was kind of like vehicle attitude because it was changing in that time, and maybe that was it. We'd lost signal strength.
Right. And Fred, your recollections of going around the moon and seeing the moon, obviously a unique experience.
It was actually entirely the views out the window, even from low Earth orbit. We went in orbit barely over 100 miles and only went around a couple of times. But the views there, and of course going out toward the moon and back, and at the moon itself, at times to me almost seemed unreal. Am I really sitting here looking at what I'm looking at? It was one of the two things that was quite different from all my years of aircraft flying, both in military and as a test pilot for NASA for 7 years. Just those views. The second thing most unusual in space flight was the zero gravity, of course, be able to float around. Other than that, though, the rocket ride, vibration levels, G levels there or entry were less than I experienced in airplanes. So that wasn't that big a deal. But the view around the moon was most spectacular to me because of the difference I saw in the backside. You know, obviously we all our lives have looked at the front side of the moon. That's the only side we look at. But how much more rugged and beat up it looked. It did not have. Of course, we only saw a little over half the backside. We couldn't see the whole backside. But it only had a few of these, what I call Mars dark areas, like the huge ones on the front side. Some people can even see a face of the moon. But we did capture some good pictures of two very prominent ones, Tsiolkovsky, which has a nice mountainous-looking feature right in its center. Tsiolkovsky was, I guess, a rocket scientist. That was an early rocketeer, like Dr. Goddard was in the United States. And the other one was the Sea of Moscow. But other than that, it was just crater after crater after crater. And I'm sure if you had better definition, you'd have seen craters within those craters. But the whole backside was just very rugged, which tells you that somehow, I don't know if it's Earth's attraction that sucked them in, but the bigger meteorites obviously had hit more on the side facing us to create those big Mars or seas.
Right. Something that you experienced, which you never hear spoken about very often, is the Earth re-entry. What was your recollections of that? I guess one of the things you were worried about was whether your spacecraft was going to be intact and hold together. But putting that aside, the rest of the re-entry, how did that feel?
Well, first of all, the correct. I think you were applying the heat shield. I never thought of the heat shield. In fact, that it would be damaged. To me, it's pretty tough material. And the damage we saw on the service module when we separated it looked pretty much like that panel blew out sideways, went straight out and tore up a lot of stuff as it went out. Thermal blankets, some of the electrical wiring in there. And did not look like it would have impacted downward toward the capsule. So I felt that we probably, even if it might have briefly crossed my mind, that I never thought the heat shield would be a problem. What was probably the only two unusual things. First one, we obviously were still freezing. It was still pretty cold in there, had not warmed up significantly. And we got rained on a little bit, because water had built up over everything in those days in a very cold environment. The water separator was well below its specifications, and it could not remove moisture, like we're breathing out moisture. And it was evident in the limb as well, even before we left it. And that water fell out from behind the panel. So we had a little light rain shower right at the top of entry as the G's started building up. The other thing that was really incredible, was the condition after being frozen for 4 days. The water tanks were found frozen when they recovered it on board the ship in the command module. So it had gone below freezing, well below specifications for certainly all the avionics, electronics. And that vehicle had come to life, and it was blown. Jack was ready to take over should it not perform well, but it did. Through the computer, automated, it flew that trajectory. And if you look at the post-flight data for the whole Apollo program, we tied for the second most accurate splashdown of the program.
Wow.
Which is incredible for that ship to have been abused for 4 days and then come to life and do that job. Yeah.
So do you ever go back and visit your spacecraft, the Odyssey? Is it?
Yes. In fact, I would have been there. Today's what, April 10th. 6 days ago, I would have been at the Cosmosphere in Kansas. We had planned an Apollo 13 celebration there on that day, April 4th. And of course, this virus changed a lot of things, including that. And so I did not get to go back. But we've normally held those celebrations, not every year, but quite a few of the years, because that's where our capsule is.
Right. And so in recent years, you've been involved in the Infinity Science Center in Mississippi, is that right?
Yes. Yeah. It's the first building you see as you come along Interstate 10, a major thoroughfare, from Louisiana into Mississippi. It's on the right, the first thing you'll see entering Mississippi. And you get there by getting off at that first exit. And to the north at that exit is Stennis Space Center.
Oh, I see.
And, so we're somewhat in partnership with NASA. They use our Infinity as their visitor center. Because of all the security rules, people can't just run around like they used to out at the center. So our facility furnishes the public view of Infinity. In fact, one of our galas, the Space Gallery, tries to do that job as well as cover NASA overall. One gallery upstairs is the Space Gallery.
Now, I haven't been there myself. I'd love to get there, but I believe out the front of that museum you've got a unique connection to a piece of hardware out there. Is that right?
I'm sorry, at the front is connection with what?
A piece of hardware on display there, the Saturn V first stage. How does that?
We have on the west side of I think you're talking about the west side of the building, we have a Saturn V first stage, full with engines. It was the last one that had been built at the Michoud facility, 50 years ago, roughly. And it had actually been shipped to Stennis with all 5 engines on a barge up the Pearl River and then into Stennis and the waterways they built, man-made canals, to be tested. They fired all 5 engines on that stage to have it ready to go to Kennedy Space Center. And they got caught with the cancellations of Apollo 18 and 19. So theoretically, I like it there because it's, if I had got to fly 19, I backed up John Young on Apollo 16, which put me in a rotation to fly 19. That's the first stage that would have lifted me off the pad again, get on my way to the moon. We also have a full-scale lunar module sitting next to it now. It came from Kennedy. It was our training mock-up that we got in to start all our EVA training down at Kennedy on that practice lunar field. We'd always start in that mock-up to go through all the procedures, getting ready to go out, and then go out on that lunar field and do our 4-hour plus EVA exercise.
Right. And you backed up John Young on 16. 16. And as part of that training, did you fly the lunar landing training vehicle?
Yes, I flew it 22 times.
Wow. How was that? Apparently that's supposed to be quite a piece of...
As Neil has said, at the time Neil ejected, and then after the mission, they were really thinking they would get rid of it, NASA management. because they crashed two of them, actually, three of them, and ended up three of them were lost. Joe Algranti jumped out of another one, had a closer shave than Neil. He only got about one swing of the chute before he hit the ground. And Stu Present jumped out sitting straight and level at 500 feet when he lost electric power.
Wow.
A NASA pilot. So they were ready to give up on that machine. But Neil told them, he said, if you want people to land on the moon, the task and the stress level provided by this trainer is what you ought to have the person have that background experience to do the job right. So Neil's the one who kind of talked NASA management out of that thought. And so all commanders got quite a few flights in the machine.
Right.
No, it was somewhat dicey in that the way you set up and the task you had put you into a time-limited situation for fuel, just like you would be in the moon. Of course, the exception was you had a bailout. You had a plan B. You could switch out of the simulation mode and then depend and fly on.
You got a crew member with you there.
And fly on your jet engine and just use the little attitude thrusters and pretty easily land just using the jet engine. So it wasn't as bad as landing on the moon in that sense, at least.
For sure. And after Apollo, you stayed with NASA and helped in the development of the space shuttle, the approach and landing tests.
Yes, actually, the way I helped first was I transferred from the astronaut office, and I went to work for Aaron Cohen in the Orbiter Project Office. So I really, for 4 years, I went into program management on shuttle. And I served on the evaluation team that evaluated the 4 proposals that came in to pick who would build it. Rockwell, as it turned out. And so I was Aaron's technical assistant, if you will, throughout that time, served on the change board, evaluating all engineering changes. I led the ops team, which is a mix of astronauts, mission controllers, our training people, to review the designs as we went through the series of designs. Typically, you go through for the development of a vehicle from program review to system review to preliminary design review to the critical design review that would kind of commit you to build it at that point, cut metal. And so I led the ops team through all the design reviews through CDR on Enterprise. And I led the team on preliminary design review on Columbia. Before then, I got reassigned to the astronaut office and named as the commander of Crew 1 to go now fly Enterprise. So it's very much a womb to tomb experience. I was there from day one of the paper proposals coming in to now get to fly that vehicle for the first time. So I look at it actually as the crowning achievement of my total career.
Oh, wow. So during that time, Fred, in the development, design, etc., of the space shuttle, as we now know later on, it failed to meet all of the sort of cost and schedule targets and plans that it had to make it a very economical and rapid turnaround vehicle. Right. Were you aware of that at the time, or was
pretty early? See, the fallacy of the what sold shuttle and to be in that vogue, if you will, was assuming you could achieve a certain flight rate. And at the time, early on, it was thought that we could make 24 flights a year, launch 24 times a year. Now, if you spread 24 flights a year over the same, call it overhead burden of labor, of material, and whatever, you know, the cost obviously is lower. And of course, I think the most in any one year ever flown was 8. I think 1 year. And so that was the fallacy. We also have to realize, again, even though we're now in the 70s, in the 80s, technology still wasn't quite far along to do what we might do today more with that kind of vehicle is automation, even on the ground processing. So we were very, very labor intensive. And if you look at recurring costs, a big part of recurring cost is the payroll. How many people you have employed to make that happen. We also, because of weight drivers, we had Air Force people involved early on trying to coach us on maintenance and what provisions to make for maintenance that would make it faster, easier, more efficient. And some of those added weight, some of the ways they would have done it that they would normally do on an airplane. And so we threw out some of that might have helped also the situation. So no, I would like to make a B model someday. I don't think that'll happen very soon. But with the learning, learning we have on that first one, we could probably do a much better job in that regard with today's capability, particularly computing power. You have to realize Enterprise I flew, its computer was like 1 megabyte.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, it was an IBM 101 we inherited that had been on the B1 program and the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, the Air Force program that got canceled. Most people don't realize where we were in computers then. Now you can't even buy anything less than about a 16 gigabyte thumb drive. And it wasn't too long ago you could only buy even an 8 or something with big. So computing assets have grown tremendously. We flew to the moon, in 1/10 of a megabyte.
Wow.
Hand wired. There were no chips yet then. So that was a hand wired machine we went to the moon with.
Going back to Apollo 13, did you, I assume, follow the investigation fairly closely about what exactly happened? How did that make you feel, and were you angry that decisions and things had been made the way they were, or was it something else?
No, I wasn't angry. It was errors made, like the instrumentation they provided to poor tech when they used the heaters to get rid of the oxygen in the tank. They topped out at a reading at a point well below the red line. So the poor tech was sitting there observing, and of course it exceeded the red line, but the meter didn't track where it had gone to in the tank. So, you can't say that was human error. It was whoever arranged the setup for this exercise they did of detanking one oxygen tank. But this is several weeks before launch, actually, in the wet countdown we did. No, you could say configuration control was a problem, and that Beach, in their upgrading of the tanks, on that particular tank had not upgraded the thermostats to be compatible with higher voltage that was used at the Cape, which was, I think, 60 some odd volts, whereas it had been, pretty much for spacecraft power, which is about 28 normally, but I think 32.5 was our normal high on the DC bus. So they missed that. But you have to think again of this world of computing assets and capability. Today, all that kind of configuration control is computerized. Then everything was paper system. Everything had to be written, signed off, sometimes even double stamped, sometimes by a person, by a quality person for the company, by a quality person for NASA, all paper. And so you think of having a paper that tracked the number of pieces and parts in that Saturn V rocket and 2 spacecraft, and if that's the only error ever made was on our thermostats, that wasn't too bad, I guess, considering the way it was done.
For sure. It was amazing. And and here we are 50 years later, and we're still struggling to get the Artemis program up and running. And how have you been following that much? Have you got thoughts on that at all?
Only what I can read in the media. I'm not involved with NASA or any of the companies directly. So the worrisome thing is, as it has been really since Apollo, is will it be funded adequately? so it can keep moving and you don't end up with stalls and stops, and eventually, like Constellation, be canceled. That's the threat.
Yeah.
It's not the people. It's the old story. Apollo was unique in that we had a mission defined, and it had pretty much the full backing politically, president through Congress, and was funded properly. At least through Apollo 11. There was some back off of the funding following that, but at least up to meeting the goal, it was fully funded per program plan. And Shuttle had that problem initially. In the program office I was in for Orbiter, we were somewhat underfunded from the program plan for the first 3 years. And that's what made us end up with deletions. We had a second Enterprise. The one I flew, we had a backup vehicle. Normally, if you run a test program, you want more than one vehicle in case something does go wrong. Air Force normally will fly an initial test program with 6 or 7 prototypes. So anyway, we canceled the second Enterprise. We turned our structural test article, OB-99, into a flight vehicle. That became Challenger. That hull was never supposed to be a flight vehicle.
Oh, right.
So we saved building another hull. We canceled test articles. The only thermal vac testing we did in the Cecil chambers was 1 payload bay door and 1 OMS pod. We said we'll test it on orbit. That's what we did. We put enough thermocouples on Columbia. The early flights did a lot of, quote, thermal testing on orbit, not in a chamber like we did in Apollo.
Wow.
Vibroacoustic. We kept the F section vibroacoustic article. Vibroacoustic is that's the sound waves and the pressure from the engine thrust at launch. But we canceled the crew cabin. That worried me at the time we did that. A lot of arguing about it, I'll tell you. Because the facility we did those tests in to test that F section, we had to add horns in there to create the dB level, because it was higher than Apollo. Because the orbiter sits a lot closer to those engines. Our capsule and the service module are way up on the tippy top on the Saturn. So we were on Shuttle. We were facing a higher dB level acoustic stress than we had in Apollo. And so we deleted one of our 2 major test articles for that.
Wow.
So those kind of things were done to take money out and still try to hold schedule, which is always your driving thing, because you're always worried about what's going to happen when you change administration too. Where one president started the program, and here you're going to go through the cycle maybe with a new leader, and how he will feel about it and how he might continue to support it.
For sure. So, Fred, you chose not to stay with NASA and fly in the shuttle. I assume that was an option for you. Just decided you'd had enough and wanted to do something different, or what?
Well, the main thing was the mission changed. I was assigned with Jack Lausma to fly the 3rd orbital mission, and it was an exciting mission. We were going to go rendezvous and save Skylab and keep it from dropping in Australia, I guess, parts of it. And or boosted higher, depending on what the policy decision makers would have decided. But we're going to fly up in rendezvous and had a little kick stage that was well along in development. It was past CDR, and they were putting parts together by Lockheed Martin in Colorado. Fly it in a payload bay, and Jack actually was going to remotely fly it over to dock it with Skylab, and then the people on the ground would actually orient Skylab the right direction to either posigrade or retrograde to boost it or deorbit it. And that mission went away, and then all was left was some RMS arm checks and part of that thermal testing I mentioned on orbit, sit in various attitudes for certain lengths of time, collecting thermocouple data. And the mission just wasn't that interesting to me as it had been. And I had the opportunity at that time to join Grumman. And long range, I was thinking of more going into the executive program management side. So the opportunity came by, and I took it, and I had 17 good years with Grumman. One of the contracts I had, interestingly, one of the large ones was with a team with Lockheed and Thiokol. I turned around shuttles on the ground for 12 years at Kennedy. I had what's called shuttle processing contract for 12 years. And then I actually left the division, a subsidiary company I had doing service business for Grumman, to go to Washington and led a contract we'd won to do the system engineering and integration on Space Station Freedom. So I did that for 4 years in Washington for the early Space Station Freedom, the one that didn't ultimately get built. ISS ended up being a slightly different configuration. But those were interesting times. You talk about short money. That program was underfunded from day one.
Is that right? Wow.
Oh yeah, it was a horrible challenge to try to hold that thing together. Fortunately, the Russians joined the program. That's what solidified it politically. That had Congress properly funded to eventually get ISS on the road.
All right, we're going to wrap up here, Sudfet. I'm going to go back to Apollo. You and I met each other in person for the first time, which was wonderful, back in 2018 at Space Fest. And I'm not sure whether you caught the fact there, but there was one of the exhibitors there had an Apollo computer that
Right.
they were restoring and getting up and running. Did you have a look at that? I believe you were a bit of a computer expert back in the Apollo era. Is that right?
Yeah, I looked at it. I mean, it was a complete machine, and he had a disky, which was the little keyboard that we use with this kind of weird syntax. You had the verb noun kind of syntax, but it appeared to be working. Now, there's no way of checking without hooking it up with some simulation of sorts to say run the entry program and see if you really had all the ones and zeros in the right place in there. But it was, as far as it was a true machine, a flight machine in every respect.
Fantastic. All right, Fred. Well, thank you so much for today. Do you want to say your last few words, and we'll wrap it up?
Well, I just say again, I wish we wasn't under this cloud, if you will, of this thing, and that we were all free to go back to our normal lives. Because I think that the term used in the States for this staying at home is hunkering down, and I'm getting kind of tired of hunkering down myself. I assume a lot of other people are, but it's unfortunately, I guess, the only way we're going to put this thing to bed and get to the other side. So I wear, feel kind of funny, but I wear a mask and wear rubber gloves. I do have a mask that was a friend made for me. It's actually got a space symbology. Got 6 of them. So it's got actually a rocket that kind of looks like the Saturn V, right about where my nose is.
Fantastic.
Anyway, I can wear that when I go out.
Wonderful.
So anyway, have a happy time, everybody, and I hope this your internet works out on the web to have this gathering.
Thank you so much, Fred. And once again, thank you so much for taking time. Do look after yourself and your wife, and enjoy your 50th anniversary, however you're going to be able to do it.
Likewise, everybody else, take care of yourselves.
Thank you so much, Fred. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'll talk to you sometime soon.
Okay.
Well, while we're waiting, can we ask questions of various people? Will that be fine?
G'day, John.
I think yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, it is a great honour to have Joe Kerwin on the line. So it's great to see you, Joe. Can you tell us a little bit about the decision to cancel the Apollos 18 and 19 that followed it? Because that happened soon after Apollo 13. Is that right? because that was, I guess, one of the things that that accident was the catalyst for that. Is that correct?
Here I am. You know, I don't know the details of why 18, 19, and 20 were canceled. I certainly remember it happening. I kind of had my head down there training for Skylab and helping to develop procedures and things. That was my big job at that time. But I know it was a significant blow for several astronauts who had waited for years and had prime crew assignments on 18, 19, and 20. And I don't think it was primarily budget driven. I think it was primarily driven by safety considerations at the management at NASA and in the Congress didn't want to go through on Apollo 13 again. They said, we've been to the moon, we've done good science, let's quit while we're ahead. Kind of sad, but
yeah, I think Apollo 20 wasn't so much cancelled; it was reassigned. The Saturn V was reassigned to launch Skylab.
The Saturn V was, yeah. I was just about to say that we did benefit from that cancellation because we went from a plan to launch the Skylab workshop, which was the inside of the S4B fuel tank, loaded with fuel. Okay, and so after you got into orbit, you let the excess out and you refilled it with oxygen a couple times, or with the 70-30% mixture we used, and then go in there and assemble everything, which would have taken the entire first mission, I think. And would not have been nearly as slick and functional as the Skylab workshop was when it was properly built on the ground and launched empty. So we gained we took a big sigh of relief and went on to other problems when that happened.
Now, of course, with Apollo 13, that was a great rescue, but your mission, Skylab, was another rescue mission, of course.
Well, it was risky to the program, and we were proud of the program. It was the prototype space station for the United States. We felt that if we met our mission responsibilities, we would open the way to the declaration that President Reagan made later, that we needed a permanent presence in space, and that we could build a space station and crew it with crews being replaced every 3 to 6 months. So we were happy with that. And then, of course, the wing came off during the launch of the workshop, when I'm an old man and I lose my nouns. So I know perfectly well what I want to say. The heat shield on the Skylab workshop ripped, and it took one of the solar panels off with it, and the other big solar panel was locked down. And so the only power we had when the thing got to orbit was the 4 smaller solar panels on the collection of telescopes that was called the Apollo telescope mount, which was fared in where the lunar module would normally go on a Saturn V launch. And after you got to orbit and you would jettison the panels, then this solar telescope mount rotated out 90 degrees so that it would point at the sun. And it was a marvelous piece of hardware. And its power, which is about a third of the original power, was enough for us to go up and live, but not to have hot coffee, and not to do a lot of the functions that we needed to do to have a successful program. So our challenge was to somehow free up that solar panel, get 2/3 of our power back, and go ahead and do the three major functions that Skylab was designed to perform. Number one was to show that human beings could live and work and do good work in space for periods of initially up to 2 months. The plan was to fly 28 days for the first mission, which we did, 56 days for the second mission. They flew 59, and the 56 again for the third mission. But the first two missions had been so successful that they extended the third mission to 84 days, close as they could get to 3 months. And that was very important, and required the third crew to make a major sacrifice and have Carnation instant breakfast bars for breakfast for 3 months because there wasn't enough food up there, and that was all they had room for. So what our crew was challenged with was, number one, to get some kind of a manually deployed heat shield over the sunny side of Skylab to bring the temperatures down into a working range, and we did that. That was fairly easy. And then 2 weeks into the mission, to do a spacewalk and get out there, Pete and I, and try and free up that solar panel. And thanks to the excellent preparatory work done by the backup crew in the water tank at Marshall, they figured out a way that they thought would be feasible for us. And once we got ourselves stabilized, we were able to carry that plan out. So the risk was to the mission, not to the crew, as it was in Apollo 13. We were never in any danger. We had our command module. We could go home if we failed. Still, it was a darn good flight. We were up there 30 days, and we had just enough free time to stare out that big window and see the Earth going by, and wish we had studied geography more in school or in preparation, because you only saw something for about 30 to 40 seconds, and then it was gone behind you. Took a lot of pictures.
I was actually quite interested when in that interview that Fred gave, in that interview before the video cut out, he said that the approach and landing tests were like the highlight of his career. And Pete Conrad once said that he considered the Skylab mission to be the highlight of his, and he'd been on the moon. And so it's quite interesting that the two.
It is. He did say that, and in a sense it was true. But a guy who stepped on the moon, to my mind, that would always be the highlight. You remember what Pete said when he stepped on the moon? He said, "That may have been a small step for Neil, but it's a giant leap for me." He was about 4 inches shorter than Neil was. But anyway, yeah, it was great having Pete up there on the flight. And the reason that Pete found Skylab so important for him personally, he had been one of the military test pilots who went through the selection process for the original 7 astronauts. And along the way during that process, he was treated very roughly by a certain Air Force surgeon and resented it. And at the bar that evening, he called the guy out and accused him of being rough and unnecessarily so. And they didn't pick him. He missed the selection, despite the fact that he was thoroughly qualified. So, and he must have told me that story 3 times during the flight. Okay, he was rejected from the original 7 for being psychologically unqualified for long duration space flight. Okay, and he wiped that one out with his flight on Skylab. It was great to have 2 veterans from Apollo willing to stick around and fly on Skylab. One of them was Pete, the other was Alan Bean.
Yeah, I think it worked out well for him in the end, so not being selected on that original Mercury 7. So looks like Peter's back now, so yeah.
Yeah, I am back. I've queued back up to, I think, about where you lost it. Sorry, everyone. I've got a very clunky old Mac, and it hung together for the most of the session. So I've only got 9 minutes left on Fred's video if you'd like to watch the rest of that. I'll start that now then.
Of Pete's, say that again.
This is the video that I was playing of Fred
The
Hayes.
video that we played of Fred Hayes, yeah.
And it cut out because I basically had a crash on my computer. So
That was very good and very reminiscent. Fred was so easy to get along with. He was so objective and capable. And of course, he's the one who got really sick during those cold, wet days flying home from around the moon. He had a kidney infection and a high fever. He didn't show it stepping outside of the command module there on the carrier, but he was not feeling good, and they hospitalized him for a few days to give him antibiotics. Get that back.
Right. And of course, Joe, you're a medical doctor as well, aren't you? So you would have been well aware of all of that.
Capcom was not to take care of the crew. We had a flight surgeon for that, and he had very little to go on. I don't think they even had antibiotics in the medical kit in those days. So, and they didn't have any cold weather here. They didn't have any sweaters or jackets or anything to put on to keep them warm. So it was a rough go. It was hard to sleep, and they shivered. Beautiful.
That was great. Lovely time. We got there in the end. Sorry about the crashes.
No, it was very good, Peter. In fact, when he's talking, I felt like jumping in and asking him questions. Oh no, that's a recording.
Yeah, I think a few people on this session have met him. I met him for the first time, as I said, in Space Fest, and very warm, very approachable. None of the big egos that some of these guys have. I would have loved to have flown with him.
I was with you.
So how many have we got left now here tonight? We've gone well over our original schedule, an hour and 20 minutes. So you've got a lot of stamina, everyone. Thank you for that. I just want to say before we finish up, I just want to say thank you to everybody, particularly Mike Dinn, John Saxon, Colin MacKellar, and Bruce Window, Ashley Hill from our Space Association, Michael Abdullah. Everyone's put a lot of work into getting all this done, and you can see that by the quality of their presentations. It's fantastic. And unfortunately, we were going to do something live in Melbourne, showing the Apollo 13 movie, but obviously that changed with everything that happened. But I think it's worked out wonderful tonight. And to have Joe Kerwin with us, my God, I had no idea. So thank you, Joe. If you're still, I'm not sure if you're still there or not.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
I was just going to join in and thank Joe. We've corresponded a little bit over the last years or so. I tried to get him out here for Apollo 11, but this is a good alternative, I think, where it's turned out. So thanks for it. What time is it, in those old-fashioned words, what time is it there, Joe, about?
It's 7:30 in the morning, just about time for that first cup of coffee.
Are you West Coast or East Coast?
I'm in the middle of the country. I'm in the Chicago area right now.
Oh, okay.
Just email me the name of that lady who proposed marriage, and I'll ask my wife what she thinks.
Her name is Tina, and she's probably still on. So we'll probably unmute her microphone now, and it'll be.
We have a very lovely.
She is on.
There's a lovely lady online here right now who hasn't spoken, Cheryl. Cheryl was at Tidbinbilla through all of this, and there's been a great mover and shaker in trying to get events here. I was just going to ask you if you've got anything to say before we sign off, Cheryl.
Just click on your microphone icon, Cheryl, if you've got it there, and just. Oh, there we go.
Oh, hello.
Can't hear you, Cheryl.
Oh, what a shame.
See you, but not hearing you.
There's a little microphone with a line through it. Just click on that and it should release your microphone.
I think she's unmuted.
Cheryl, you can just hit the space bar and keep it pressed there, and that will unmute you.
Maybe. Oh, well.
I think she is unmuted. She is unmuted.
Anyway, you can see a picture of her in her youth behind with S42 antenna there.
She hasn't changed at all.
Not at all. Not at all. The rest of us have gone bald. All right, back to you, Peter.
All right. I guess I had a crash before, so I guess I missed a bit of your discussion. But Joe, the highlight of your mission to the space station, so you're on the first mission, right? The mission that actually got the thing fired back up again.
Right. It was the medical objectives were prime in that mission. So I got to fly in the first one. Owen Garriott came to me a few months before the flight and said, Joe, you're the doctor. You should go on the longer mission. So why don't we swap places and I'll go on the first mission and you can have my place on the second mission. And I said, I didn't think that was a very good idea.
And of course, your mission changed dramatically because the space station was basically inoperable and failing. So you had to do surgery.
And therefore, I have to say that the highlight of that was definitely the spacewalk. It was when we had done all the preliminaries. We had figured out how to stabilize me so that I could get the jaws of the limb lopper over the offending scrap of metal that was holding everything down. Pete had gone hand over hand down there with sharp edges everywhere to fasten a rope to the end of the solar panel. And then the two of us, I tied the other end of it back to a stanchion. The two of us got under the rope and stood up, and we exerted enough tension on that solar panel to unfreeze the hinge. And all of a sudden, we standing up, pushing, all of a sudden we went ass over tea kettle into outer space, pulled ourselves back by our umbilical, and turned around, and that solar panel cover was fully 100% up, and you could see the panels starting to come out. And
wow.
That's when I knew that mission control and the subsequent crews were going to love us.
Indeed.
That was that was the highlight.
So have you been to Esperance to see your spacecraft in Western Australia? You
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we regret that, but it turned out okay. We didn't hurt anybody. That was an interesting thing. All through the years after the last crew left, and you heard from Fred that the plan was to visit Skylab and either bring some kind of a propulsion module to hook on and bring it back into a higher orbit, or to do the same thing in reverse and deorbit it in a controlled fashion. We had two centers tracking Skylab's orbit. We had Marshall, which said it was going to stay up there till 1983, and we had Goddard, which said they weren't so sure. It looked like solar activity was increasing and the drag at that altitude was going to bring it down. And Goddard was right. And so it was, I don't remember the dates exactly now, but somewhere in 1978, I think that they came to us and said it looked like Skylab was not going to make it into the shuttle era. And they assembled a small team and they went out to Bermuda. Skylab was essentially dead. It was drifting, but the solar panels, when they pointed at the sun, developed enough voltage on the line that they thought they had a chance to communicate with it. The only station that still had the old gear was Bermuda. So they went out to Bermuda, and every time it flew over, they said hello. And finally, after 12 or 13 tries, it said hello back.
Oh, wow.
And they managed to establish communication, stabilize the attitude. They got a guy from IBM to come and build a new attitude control model for it, and then carefully planned the orbits so that they could transfer from minimum drag to maximum drag, but just by changing the attitude of the spacecraft in time to slow it down and bring it into the Pacific Ocean west of Australia. They miscalculated the mass of the Skylab a little bit. They used pre-flight numbers, and it was a little heavier. So it didn't come in quite as far off the coast as it should have. And some of the heavier pieces landed in Southwest Australia, but they didn't hurt anybody. And I don't think even they scared some cows. That's about as far as it got. One lucky young man found a piece of it quick, because there was a radio station up in California that had promised a prize to the first person to bring them a piece of Skylab, and he won the prize. Of course, I was lucky enough to be assigned to Australia a few years after that, and I had no sooner arrived on the airplane, had been driven to my new office in Canberra, and met my new secretary, Lucy, when the phone rang. And she's gestured, and I picked up the phone and said, NASA representative Joe Kerwin. And this guy said, "I've got a bloody great piece of Skylab, and I wonder if you're still buying them." And he did. It turned out he had a scarred but intact oxygen tank from Skylab. And unfortunately, we weren't buying the parts anymore. They had enough to satisfy their scientific desires. But I officially recognized it, that it was a true piece of Skylab, and he was going to hang it out in front of his bar somewhere down there in the Southwest. And that was my introduction to your fine country.
I was at school at the time, and when Skylab came down, I found an old carburetor in the garage, and I put some black powder and stuff on it and put it into a shoebox and took it into school the next day and said, "Look what landed in the backyard yesterday."
Evil. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Joe, if they had saved Skylab, were there plans to actually reuse it and resupply it and so on, or would it just be left early?
There was a plan to reuse Skylab. There was a plan during or shortly after our missions, when it still looked good, to do a Skylab 2 or a Skylab B, I guess, get some new crews up there and do so, because there were a lot of experiments that people had wanted to do, and there just wasn't time or transportation enough to do them. And one of the biggies, I kind of wish we had done this, was to rotate Skylab rapidly enough to form artificial gravity at the two ends of it, and do some experiments on the effect of the crew of creating a third of a G or half a G of artificial gravity, and see if that helped them with the ill effects of long-term weightlessness. Because you do decondition, your bones lose calcium, your muscles get weak. You have to exercise to do some things as countermeasures, and artificial G had long been a candidate, for example, for a Mars mission or some other truly long duration float. It would be great to have a Mars spacecraft that had an inertial core and then a rotating crew habitat around it, so that the crew wouldn't decondition too much on the way to Mars. But none of that took place, and right now I think we're in such good shape with 6-month experience on the International Space Station that we don't really need the complications of artificial G. So there we are.
Wow.
Hi, Mike. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
I fixed the problem. It was lovely to hear from you, Joe. I was at Tidbinbilla.
Are you all right, Tidbinbilla?
During Apollo 13.
During
yes.
Apollo 13.
I did all the paperwork. Updated all the manuals.
Yeah.
And it was just full on, and I loved every minute of it.
It was very exciting, wasn't it?
Oh, just the most exciting adventure of my life, being at Tidbinbilla. I was there for Apollo 12 as well.
It was a pleasure for me to just visit Tidbinbilla, and I did so more than once during my time down there, and think about the old time. During 13, I had only a very hazy notion of how the Deep Space Network worked and what you people were actually doing. I learned that after I came there. But thank you, belatedly, very belatedly, for bringing my friends on 13 home.
That's Australia. I worked with some incredible men. I mean, they really gave all, and I wanted to put up my story because no other women have done a story. You know, it's just I did my story from my point of view, and hopefully Colin's putting it up tomorrow for my birthday.
Oh, great!
Oh, happy birthday!
My birthday is tomorrow. And Apollo 13 was launched in Australia on my birthday.
And that day.
So I'm celebrating. I was 24. So you see the picture on the side. That's me at 24.
Wow.
So it's Apollo 13 is very special to me.
Me too.
Me
too. We'll share that one.
Yeah. And I tried to get some celebrations going in Canberra for Apollo 13, as Mike will attest.
Well,
and I really wanted to do something, but this pandemic took over, and well, hopefully we all come out of it in the end, but are well and happy. But maybe next year we could do something.
Okay, after that, maybe for Skylab. Let's hope.
Well, I was just, I left after Apollo 13, or at the end of 1970, I left Tidbinbilla to go on to do other things.
We just need an excuse to have a party.
I'll party anytime. I just want to go down and meet all you guys in Canberra. So we had planned to do that this year, but of course we couldn't do it next year.
Is Canberra locked down the way we are over here?
Yes, I'm sure. Well, yes, Australia is locked down. I live in Queensland on the Sunshine Coast. And of course, they've locked, all the borders have been locked down, and we're actually isolating at home now.
Yeah, us too.
It's one of the nicest places to be locked down in the world, I'd say, the Sunshine Coast.
Yeah, so we live on acreage, so we live on 4 acres, and we have a pool, and it's warm enough to still swim. So we're very lucky.
Yeah, that's right.
Very blessed.
Very nice to have met you.
Yeah, very nice to have met all of you, and thank you, and good night.
Good night.
So, Joe, I wanted to ask, and I think I know the answer to this. You've seen the movie Searching for Skylab?
The movie, what? The movie?
Searching for Skylab. It's a documentary movie made by...
no, I have not seen it.
John, Mike, they showed it in Canberra, didn't they, a little while ago?
They did, and I can't remember its name now, nor can I remember the maker of it.
Just in the last couple of years?
Was waving as if.
Yes.
Stephen Benecki, is that?
Bonjeski.
I didn't see the movie though.
Right.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's supposed to be incredible.
Right. Oh yes, it's Dwight, Stephen. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll try and get to it.
We'll try and send you the details, Joe. I'll send you an email.
All right. Appreciate it.
Yes.
We can
have a watch party.
Yeah. You start.
Okay. So I think I'll sign off and thank you all for having me. It's been a great chat.
It's been an absolute honour to have you with us, Joe. I really appreciate it.
So
Thank you, Joe.
If you put up chat, it's up, there's a link someone just put up on chat there. Do you know how to do that? Bring up chat.
There's a little box at the bottom of your window, the side of your window, called with a little chat, like a talking box. And you click on that. Click on that, and you'll see the chat, and there's a link in there to the information about that. Searching for Skylab movie.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Great. I'll do it.
It's on Wikipedia, so just do a search and you'll find it. Yeah.
And I think you feature heavily.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks,
Take care.
Joe.
Thank you.
Right. Can we go home now, Dad?
I think so. Tina, you didn't propose.
Thanks, Joe. Love you, Joe.
That's Tina, your second wife in Tasmania. Well, that was wonderful. How about that?
It was great.
That exceeded all expectations.
Yeah, well, I've written to Joe over the years, and I tried to get him out for Apollo 11, but he couldn't. And I thought, well, it's worth a go for this event. And even then, the last email I got from him, he said he wasn't sure he can be able to make it. Anyway, I was really pleased when he joined it.
No, it was really great. Thanks. That was fantastic, Mike. I mean, with Cheryl having her birthday tomorrow, in fact, there'll be quite a few people having their 50th birthdays, because Apollo 13 occurred almost exactly nine months after Apollo 11.
Boom, boom.
There you go. Who would have thought?
Happy days.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Peter, and for everybody. It's been a fun evening and great to have Joe, of course, too.
It has.
Look, Cole's going to get back to his day job.
Indeed. Okay, so we've gone for 3.5 hours. So that's incredible. So thanks, everyone.
Peter. This has been quite fascinating.
Good.
So,
First time I've been involved in this, and it's been
oh,
really
terrific.
fascinating. So yeah.
Well, if you go to our website, space.asn.au, there's a link there to our YouTube channel. So this will go up on our YouTube channel at some point in the next couple of days, I suspect. And where are you?
I'm in Melbourne.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh, you have to come along to one of our meetings when we actually meet again. We meet down at the Golden Gate Hotel in South Melbourne.
No,
Is it worth asking at this stage who's the furthest away from Australia? Who's online?
I
Well,
think it
obviously
might
Joe-
be Rob. Is it?
Rob.
I'm in Texas.
Oh, okay, Rob.
The sun is rising.
Special medal. Who else?
Well,
Oh,
I
well,
bet. I think that takes the biscuits, takes the chocolates. Well, how did you hear about us, Joe? Oh, sorry.
There's someone
Rob.
from Scotland in Glasgow.
Is there?
Tony Clark.
Oh, okay. Greetings, Rob. How did you hear about our little shindig here tonight?
I'm a friend of Colin's, and
Oh,
he told me
terrific.
about it last night.
Oh, terrific.
What I call it, part of the worldwide space mafia.
All right, Peter. Thanks,
Yes.
mate. That was excellent. I couldn't have. It's excelled my expectation. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. Fantastic.
All right. Well, we'll catch you all tomorrow.
All right. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. We'll end the meeting now, and we'll see you next time. Keep track of our social media and emails and things, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks,
For now. Bye.
Bye.
See you guys. Thanks very much.
Communication.